Hello, everyone. I'm Yuval Levin. I'm Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to a set of conversations about democracy and the American right. We at AEI are very pleased to co-host this event with the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia. UVA has been really ramping up its work on questions surrounding the health of American democracy in the last few years, and as befits Thomas Jefferson's University, they've been doing it in a way that's deeply rooted in the American political tradition and the founding ideals of our society. And we at AEI have also been increasingly focused on the health of the American Republic, our constitutional system, our political culture over the last few years, with particular attention to the history of American conservatism and the condition of the country's core institutions. And so we're very pleased to be taking up these questions together today. We're obviously living in a period of public doubt and skepticism about our democracy. Mistrust, alienation, a kind of antinomian populism are very powerful now in American life. And in some ways, that's not fundamentally a question of left and right. One striking measure of that sense of unease that the public has about our democratic institutions has to do with people's views of the legitimacy of key institutions and leaders. Since about the beginning of the 21st century, just about a third of Americans at any given time have said the sitting president was illegitimate, that he hadn't been properly elected or wasn't eligible to be president. It's been a different third under different presidents, but with Bush and Obama and Trump and now Biden, large portions of the opposite party's voters have said the president was not legitimate. That's one marker of the way in which this period has been a time of real trouble, real weakness when it comes to the public's confidence in American democracy. And when people are asked more directly about confidence, the results often look even worse. Just a third of Americans say they have confidence in the federal government. Trust in Congress, when Gallup last measured it last year, was just a hair into the double digits. We're now almost at the point of talking about friends and relatives of members of Congress when you ask people who trusts the institution. The courts, which are the least democratic of our institutions, have a little more public trust. About half of Americans trust them, better than the other branches, but not great. And among other things, this suggests a level of skepticism about our constitutionalism, our small r republicanism, and our small d democratic institutions. For progressives, that skepticism often seems rooted in a kind of hostility to the counter-majoritarian elements of the Constitution in particular. The Senate, the Electoral College, in some respects the Bill of Rights, increasingly also the courts. And that's been part of the American left's approach to the Constitution for more than a century, a kind of democratic skepticism of a Republican Constitution. I wouldn't want to oversimplify that view. It's a subject that certainly deserves a conference of its own. But what about the right? The American right has always been a mix of populists and conservatives, the former more friendly to the empowerment of the broad public, the latter more protective of Republican limits on the reach of majorities. And yet, in this particularly populist moment, the American right increasingly feels besieged in our culture and doesn't always seem to be confident that majorities of Americans would be on its side. So how should we think about the historical relationship between American conservatism and the country's democratic ethos and institutions? And where's that relationship headed now? Those questions really form our subject for today. We're going to take it up in two panels. The first, moderated by UVA's Gerard Alexander, will feature Jennifer Burns of Stanford and Matthew Continetti of AEI. And the second, moderated by Mary Kate Carey of UVA, will feature Patrick Allett from Emory and Ross Douthat, who, among his lesser affiliations, is also a fellow with us at AEI. You'll hear more about the panelists as each panel is introduced by its moderator, so let me say at the outset a few words about our two moderators. Gerard Alexander is a professor of politics at the University of Virginia, the author, among other things, of a wonderful book called The Sources of Democratic Consolidation, which I really read as a book about the right and democracy. He's also studied, among other things, the factors that affect people's views about the size and role of government, and many other questions that will relate to our subjects today. He's widely published both in the academic literature and more popular venues. Mary Kate Carey is a practitioner senior fellow at the Miller Center at UVA and teaches in the Department of Politics there. She was a presidential speechwriter for George H.W. Bush and a senior Justice Department official, and a longtime columnist for U.S. News and World Report, among many other things. For those of you watching live online, we're going to begin now with our first panel and then take a break and return for the second, and we'll make sure that you've got all the information you need about how to find us and when as you go. And we are glad to take your questions in the course of these conversations. Feel free to send them anytime, and our moderators will gather them together when the moment is right and put them to the panelists. You can ask questions in two ways, by email or through Twitter. You can email Nicole Penn, nicole.penn, P-E-N-N, at aei.org, or reach us over Twitter with the hashtag AEI conservatism. And with that, I'll turn things over to Gerard Alexander and get our first panel started. Gerard?
Thank you. Thank you, Yuval. As Yuval mentioned, I'm a professor in the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. I'm also a former visiting scholar at AEI. So one time in my life, this one I can be accused of, accurately, of dual loyalties. I'm going to introduce our two panelists. I'm going to keep these brief so we can get right to the heart of the matter. Let me start with Professor Jennifer Burns. I first met Professor Burns when she was teaching history at the University of Virginia before she plunged down the rankings and moving to Stanford, where she is today an associate professor of history. Professor Burns focuses on the 20th century United States, working at the intersection of intellectual and political history. Her interest is in the ideas and politics surrounding the role of markets and the role of the state. And that's informed a great deal of her research on modern American conservatism, libertarianism, and also liberalism. Those interests were very much on display in her compelling intellectual biography of Ayn Rand, Goddess of the Market, and they will be on display again in her book in progress about the exceedingly influential economist Milton Friedman. Since Matt Continetti was an undergraduate at Columbia, I'll rub in his face the fact that Jennifer went to Harvard. Matt, as I'll insist on calling him, is that okay? Is a senior fellow here at AEI. He's been a writer and editor at the Weekly Standard, where he and I first met what seems like a lifetime ago. Later at the Free Beacon, of which he was the editor-in-chief, and at Commentary and National Review. He's been published in innumerable outlets, has two books under his belt, on K Street and on the media's treatment of Sarah Palin, both of which had as their subject conservative characters and their presence and role and dynamics surrounding them in modern American politics and society. And he's on the verge of releasing a major book, major in this case meaning both important and over 400 pages long, analyzing the last 100 years of the American right. We're very fortunate, all joking aside, to have here two of the most interesting thinkers today about the modern right-of-center American political thought. So let's let them get us started.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Gerard and Yuval, for setting us up. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this event. Gee, conservatism and democracy in 20 minutes. Okay, that's kind of a tall order. But I decided I would approach it through two figures who I know the best, that being Ayn Rand, the subject of my first book, and Milton Friedman, the subject of my current book. Now, I already hear the objection. These two are not conservatives. So I direct your attention not to the title of the event, but to the panel, which is The Right and Democracy. And I actually think this is a very useful term to talk about the right. It doesn't need to be pejorative. What it does is extends our view to the really broad diversity of thought and opinion across the political spectrum and within the political spectrum. And I'm delighted that Matt's book will be taking up some of these themes as well. So, and I also want to say, there's a lot of empirical evidence that these two thinkers, Rand and Friedman, no matter what they called themselves, had a strong impact on the American conservative movement. Now, I think it's a more open question, their presence on the right today, one I'd be happy to take up in the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to focus on the past. Starting with Ayn Rand, I can actually be pretty brief here. And I want to start by talking about a comment made by Roy Childs, who was a libertarian thinker in the late 1960s. And he pointed out, about 1969, he wrote an essay that noted there were no elections in Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged being Ayn Rand's magnum opus, her lengthy novel of 1957. And Childs went on to notice that for a political novelist, Rand's work was strangely removed from the workaday stuff of democracy. Not only weren't there elections, there weren't political parties, there weren't political coalitions, politicians, campaigns to get out the vote. And I think, from what I know of Rand, I'm certain this was a conscious choice. And I think that if queried about this, Rand would have said, ideas and moral values are, to use today's parlance, upstream from politics. So she was going to focus on the more important stuff. Nonetheless, there remains the point, as Childs argued, that she did not have much to say on democracy. And this was a fundamental weakness in libertarianism from Childs' perspective, that one of its major thinkers had not grappled with democratic practices or institutions. Now, Rand is not exhaustive of libertarianism, but as I've argued, she's a sort of gateway drug to life on the right. She brings a lot of people into the movement. So the fact that she doesn't engage deeply with democracy, I think, is important and something to think about. It's meaningful that democracy is subordinated in her work and doesn't occupy a large space. Okay, so moving on to Milton Friedman, who I'm currently writing about. You know, there's many different ways to approach his reckoning with democracy. And as I thought about this, he was an active observer and a commentator on political events from the 1930s until his death in 2006. So I decided ultimately I would approach it through the question of capitalism, Friedman being an economist and one who centered free enterprise and free markets both in his academic work and his more popular work. And so I want to ask the question, how does democracy intersect with Friedman's desire for an unencumbered price system and his belief that a free price system was the best way to support the ultimate value of freedom? So how does democracy fit with capitalism? And what's interesting is that some of Friedman's most famous arguments collapsed the two. So rather than democracy, he often talked about the political market. He put it in a market framework. And he went on to argue that the actual market, capitalism, was better at democracy than the political market. And one of the ways he elaborated this idea is what I'll call the necktie theory of democracy. Some of you who know Friedman might have heard this before, but I'll lay it out. This was an analogy where he posited, a thought experiment, a stripped down, abstract thought experiment, but one he thought made an important point. The issue at hand, should neckties be red or green? And he argues that if this is going to be, quote, decided by a political mechanism, everybody votes. If 51% of the people vote that ties shall be red, 100% of the people get red neckties. If in the economic market, each one of us goes to the store separately, so if 51% of the people vote that ties shall be red, 51% get neckties and 49% get green neckties. Everybody gets what he votes for. Now, this is a fundamental difference between the two markets. Now, interestingly, this necktie analogy was a favorite of Margaret Thatcher. She actually recycled it in some of her own speeches. At the same time, it outraged Friedman's critics because it seemed he was collapsing two very different things. And he was sort of, pushing democracy and capitalism together and debasing democratic processes by imagining them as simply akin to a market-based system. So Friedman was, in fact, critical of democracy. He goes on in the same speech, was one he gave in many different venues, to say that, quote, the economic market is a more effective means for achieving political democracy than is a political market. I'll say that again. The economic market is a more effective means for achieving political democracy than is a political market. Now that's a big claim. There's a lot of ways to unpack it, but let me summarize what Friedman goes on to say after elaborating his necktie theory of democracy. He basically argues the political market is reductive because it's a yes or no. It's an up or down vote. So sort of by definition, people don't get what they want. Now, one of the problems he diagnoses is not necessarily that you might not get what you want, but that because you have this abstract yes or no, the process of voting and of deciding becomes very abstracted from what people actually want. The yes or no doesn't adequately capture their needs or their interests. So voters become disengaged from the yes or no process, and this opens up this space for the involvement of special interests who are very involved in the yes or no process because it reflects exactly on their specific needs. So as he goes on to say, this all accumulates in what he calls the, quote, fundamental defect of the political mechanism, that it becomes, quote, a system of highly weighted voting, under which the special interests have great incentive to promote their own interests at the expense of the general public. So in some ways, he's saying the democratic process isn't fundamentally democratic because special interests rather than majorities are the true winners. And he said, majorities really are a sort of cobbled together collection of special interests rather than reflecting a true sentiment. And this is why he thought economic markets were in some sense more democratic than actual democratic processes. Now, in saying all this, it was really important to touch upon Friedman's optimism and his vision of capitalism. So he firmly believed that markets would spread prosperity. The freer the market, the greater the prosperity. And he had a great faith in the capacity of individuals, no matter their skills and talents, to find a place in markets as long as markets were open. If they couldn't, it was because of barriers to entry or restrictions, and he spent a lot of his time arguing against things like licensure or other laws which made it harder for the average person to be part of market competition and serve those special interests more easily. So we could say there's a democratic, even a populist cast to his understanding of capitalism. And that's important to keep in mind when we see him putting capitalism and democracy together. So many of the ideals we today might think of as democratic ideals, Friedman in fact thought were ideals of capitalism and could be expressed through a free market system. Okay, so there's another aspect of Friedman's critique of democracy I think is pretty interesting. And it goes beyond the theory to talk about examples. And so in 1976, this is the time when he's really talking a lot about the necktie theory, Friedman saw a pattern in democratic polities. And so we talked about how he sees special interests kind of rising to the fore. These special interests called on the government to spend more for their own needs. This spending caused a political crisis. In Friedman's day was the crisis of inflation, seen in all advanced democracies in the 1970s. And then critically, this inflation led to a loss of freedom or a loss of democracy as the political system moved away from democratic solutions to meet the crisis. And one example he talked about was New York City. That New York City had spent itself into bankruptcy and then ended up in a receivership. And his point was, the voters of New York City elected a certain city government, and then that was the democratic process, but then they ended up in receivership controlled by unelected bureaucrats in New York, the comptroller. That was a loss of democracy. So there's almost like a dialectical pattern here. Too much democracy leads to its opposite or subverts itself. So that's another aspect of Friedman's critique. So we really have a sort of multi-layered critique of democracy. One, that it's too reductive of personal choice. Two, there's kind of maybe even a dialectical pattern of too much democracy leading to not enough democracy. I also think beyond kind of understanding his vision of capitalism, we really need to set this within American culture and within Friedman's strong belief that America had a powerful democratic culture and that he was sort of making this critique from within a system of democratic values and practices he thought was incredibly strong. So to sort of lay that out, I want to go back to a debate he had with his friend Fritz Machlup, an Austrian economist, in 1952. Found this remarkable series of letters between them, which arose when Machlup revealed to Friedman that he was not going to vote for Eisenhower. He was going to vote for Stevenson. He could not vote for Eisenhower because Eisenhower was in the same party as Joseph McCarthy, who he thought was a real threat. And so here you have the two men going back and forth, and we have to remember the backdrop of World War II, of Nazi Germany. And Friedman says to Machlup, quote, "I believe you are seeing ghosts under the table where there are none." He says, quote, "The democratic tradition here is deep and profound. It is really part of our culture." He does admit that, quote, "McCarthy is not a new phenomenon." He mentions the Palmer raids, other incursions on what he was calling at that point civil rights, freedom of speech and association. But, Friedman argues, quote, "Again and again, the public at large has been taken in only so far and no farther. Let us keep a sense of perspective." So as I talk about the way Friedman critiqued democracy, we have to keep in mind that it was within a framework of belief that democracy, American democracy, was fundamentally robust and strong. So in other words, he was a friendly critic. Now, it's a slightly different story looking internationally, so I just want to open out a little bit before I end. And Friedman, throughout his career, engaged with a whole variety of non-democratic regimes as an active economist, as a consultant. He did this in the service of strengthening their market economies. He always believed that market freedom would lead to political freedom. So the most famous of these was his connection to Chile. With limited time, I'm not going to focus on his connections with the early years of the dictatorship, but a little bit on the aftermath. So I want to fast forward into 1980. The 1980 Mont Pelerin Society meeting was held in Chile, and it turned out to be a referendum on this question of capitalism and democracy. The opening speaker, as everyone gathered together, said the following in the first session, quote, "After 40 years of socialist recklessness, only one road remained open to us, Friedmanism. Always provided we have a government strong and courageous enough to establish it." Now, sitting in the audience, Friedman was horrified to hear this. He did not want his name used to this claim that actually capitalism couldn't thrive in a democratic system, that capitalism needed authoritarianism. And for most of his career, Friedman was busy arguing against the left. And he all of a sudden finds he's got to make an argument against the anti-democratic right. And so the next day, he stands up, and these remarks are reported in the Chilean press. He says, quote, "The belief that only a strong government can generate a social market economy or markets open to the world was dangerous to assert," Friedman argued. And he went on having to say what he probably was surprised to have to say, that, quote, "It is also possible to generate a free market economic policy in a democratic political regime." So in some ways, Friedman is kind of seeing one of his fears, his arguments, that too much democracy can lead to an excess of democracy, but or a lack of democracy, finding someone say, this is the way the world is, this is how the world works. And he wants to say that's absolutely not the case. Coming back to the United States, he was still writing a column for Newsweek, widely read. He reflected on what he had seen in this column, and he argued he said there was a, quote, "new proposition" he needed to stress. And economic freedom for him was still vital. He wanted to stress economic freedom, but he didn't want to lead with it in quite the same way, because he said he now understood that political freedom was vital to economic freedom. As he wrote in Newsweek, quote, "Political freedom is a necessary condition for the long-term maintenance of economic freedom." So in some ways, he had ended up coming full circle. You know, he still had this compare and contrast between political freedom and economic freedom, but he was no longer saying there was something in political freedom that was flawed vis-a-vis economic freedom. He was actually saying they were interrelated on maybe an even deeper level than he had perceived before. And in some sense, political freedom had become foundational. Now, ultimately, in the years ahead, Friedman felt quite vindicated by Chile's transition to democracy. The country now had both economic and political freedom as he had hoped. He felt extremely confident China would follow the same path. It's one reason he supported the country's entry into the WTO. So he believed in his bones that economic freedom did lead to political freedom in almost all cases. Now, there's more to say on all of this, but time is short. So let me just wrap up by saying, you know, we're not going to find in either Rand or Friedman a deep account of democracy. Although Friedman had this necktie theory, it really was little more than casual empiricism. It wasn't a fully developed theory. That's all right. He's an economist. But it's potentially a problem, not just for this conversation, but in the sense that Childs noted, that major icons of conservative thought didn't turn their focus on democracy in a deep way. Now, I also want to go back to Friedman's letter to a friend, to Fritz Machlup. So as they were arguing, he put forth the claim that Eisenhower was, quote, "imbued with American ideals." And Friedman went on to say these ideals were sort of a natural constraint on those in power. They served in some way as like the substrate of political life. As he told Machlup, and this is referring to several of the German leaders of the era of Hitler's rise, quote, "You need not only a Hindenburg, a Hitler, a von Papen, you also need a Hegel." With Hegel, he's talking about the German philosopher who, far preceded the political turn to fascism. So when he wrote this to Machlup, I think it actually reflects on what Friedman thought he himself was doing, that by making freedom a first principle and defending it in the public sphere and the academic sphere, Friedman was trying to be America's Hegel, but one that prevented dictatorship, a Hegel that underwrote freedom. So if we aren't going to find in Rand and Friedman a particularly deep account of democracy, we might find something else. We might find something that can be mobilized into the substrate of a democratic culture. A vision of the individual, a vision of the importance of choices, a hope and belief that individual choices can make a difference. And in the end, this individualist vision needs to be mobilized to a specific democratic context, to a two-party system of constrained and sometimes dissatisfying choices. So this is a task that Friedman left undone, and it's a task that lies before us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Gerard. Thank you, UVA, AEI. Hello, Internet. In 1949, the political scientist David Spitz published a monograph with the title Patterns of Antidemocratic Thought. The book was a defense of majority rule against the criticisms of social philosophers such as George Santayana, Irving Babbitt, Ralph Adams Cram, and James Burnham. Each of these early to mid-20th century thinkers became influential in the American conservative movement. Each of them poked holes in democratic theory. Each of them echoed arguments made as far back as Plato, as well as by comparatively more recent conservatives, such as Edmund Burke and Alexis de Tocqueville. According to this line of thinking, first past the post-democracy, the unmediated rule of the majority was excessively egalitarian, conformist, stultifying, inimical to minority rights, and overly welcoming of the ministrations of the state. For Burnham, you couldn't even have democracy, because democracy always ended up being the rule of an oligarchy of elites. Democracy, according to these thinkers, elevated the tastes of the uncultured majority. It repressed the talents of the natural aristocracy. The rule of 50% plus one was sometimes hard to distinguish from the rule of the mob. The conservative solution to democracy's weakness was representative government and constitutionalism. Rather than have the public rule by plebiscite, conservatives urged that the public elect representatives from among the notable citizenry, upstanding individuals who could distill, dilute, and modulate public opinion into reasonable consensus. And rather than direct democracy, conservatives preferred reliance on constitutional forms that separated and diffused power, pitting faction against faction, ambition against ambition. The collapse of liberal democratic states in Europe into fascist, authoritarian, and communist regimes in the 1930s had intensified this conservative worry. In 1932, the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset published The Revolt of the Masses in English for the first time. Ortega warned in his book that the rise of the mass man endangered small r Republican government and high culture. Ortega's mass man was a man without qualities, a man who thought of himself as common, insignificant, a mere part of an undifferentiated crowd. The mass man, Ortega said, was the consequence of untrammeled democracy, of classlessness. The mass man was uneducated, ill-informed, fickle, coarse, and quick to anger. He was ripe for totalitarian picking. As David Spitz's book suggests, conservative angst over the future of democracy ran against the mainstream of American thought. American conservatives always have had to balance their fear of the crowd and concern for the individual against the American faith that the public is never wrong. This tension became more acute in the second half of the 20th century, when conservatives quite unexpectedly found themselves on the same side as the public. The complicated relationship between conservatism and the idea of democracy is visible in the writings of two important 20th century American conservative thinkers, William F. Buckley Jr. and Irving Kristol. Buckley was a cradle conservative. His skepticism toward majority rule came from his father, Will Buckley, as well as Will Buckley's friend, Albert J. Nock, the libertarian elitist whose books Our Enemy, the State, and Memoirs of a Superfluous Man influenced the young Buckley. When he debuted in the public arena, Buckley held what you might call an instrumental view of public control. In liberal-dominated institutions, such as the academy and the federal bureaucracy, Buckley argued for majority oversight. When it came to democratic theory, however, Buckley lambasted, I quote, the liberals' fetishistic commitment to democracy. Liberals, Buckley said, privilege the methods of democracy, elections, the franchise, regardless of the result. I quote, democracy must be justified by its works, he wrote, not by doctrinaire affirmations of intrinsic goodness that no mere method can legitimately lay claim to. Buckley associated free elections with moral relativism and with the, quote, radical social experimentation of the New Deal, the Fair Deal, and Eisenhower's modern republicanism. The more democratic America became, Buckley suggested, the more it moved away from, I quote, America's tradition of fixed postulates having to do with the meaning of existence, with the relationship of the state to the individual, of the individual to his neighbor, so clearly enunciated in the enabling documents of our republic, close quote. Buckleyite conservatives defended what they called a transcendental moral order that was higher than mere election returns. We believe, Buckley wrote, that truth is neither arrived at nor illuminated by monitoring election results, binding though these are for other purposes, but by other means, including a study of human experience, close quote. Buckley infamously applied these principles to the controversies over voting rights for African Americans in the segregated South during the 1950s. I quote, universal suffrage is not the beginning of wisdom or the beginning of freedom, he wrote in Why the South Must Prevail, a National Review editorial from 1957 that argued against an Eisenhower-backed civil rights bill. I quote, reasonable limitations upon the vote are not exclusively the recommendation of tyrants or oligarchists. Was Jefferson either, Buckley asked? And don't answer that question today. Unlike some other conservatives at the time, Buckley justified segregation on cultural grounds, a view he later repudiated. I quote, it is more important for any community anywhere in the world to affirm and live by civilized standards than to bow to the demands of a numerical majority, close quote. During the Kennedy years, Buckley worked on a book project with the tentative title, The Revolt Against the Masses. The title was, of course, a play on Gassette's masterpiece, which had been reissued in 1957. But Buckley had a problem. He could not figure out who his masked man was. And there were times when the same masked man Ortega feared came out in favor of William F. Buckley Jr. In 1956, Buckley had written that he'd, quote, sooner be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston telephone directory than by the first 2,000 members of the faculty of Harvard University. Who was on the other end of those Boston telephone numbers but for masked men, the same men who would provide Buckley 13% of the vote in the 1965 New York City mayoral race? At the same time, Buckley agreed with National Review's senior editor Frank Meyer that populism and conservatism are antithetical. In his 1968 encounter with George Wallace, Buckley attacked the Alabama governor's welfare policies. Wallace's politics, he implied, were the politics of the demagogue who drew strength from the masses. I quote, my point is that this is a free enterprise country and that we have a tradition here of private philanthropy, a philanthropy conducted by private people and under programs that haven't required mobilization of the machinery of the state at the federal or state or local level, Buckley told Wallace during a debate on his show Firing Line. That the whole tradition of your kind of Democrat, Buckley went on, is one of enormous enthusiasm for federal handouts and the public support they engender. Buckley included excerpts from Ortega y Gasset and the British political theorist Michael Oakeshott in his 1970 anthology of conservative thought. Both authors, Buckley said, feared the masked man. For Oakeshott, Buckley wrote, the danger is that this new man will be driven through ignorance, inexperience, and a desire for certainty to simplistic ideology. For Ortega, This new man is incapable of maintaining the structure of value. He is self-indulgent, undisciplined, sure of himself even though a mediocrity. Oakeshott, Buckley went on, sees the danger of mass fanaticism. Ortega, of widespread vulgarization and of ethical breakdown. Close quote. It may not be a coincidence that in the years after 1968, Buckley became less central to American conservatism as American conservatism became more populist and as American conservative leaders spoke for the silent majority against liberal politicians, judges, bureaucrats, and journalists. Indeed, Buckley was criticized by the new right of the time. He adhered to the tradition of skepticism toward mass politics and mass publics. He too, in his final years, became something of a superfluous man. Like Buckley, Irving Kristol started to write, but never finished, a big book about American democracy. And like Buckley, Kristol also drew on the revolt of the masses. In Kristol's 1969 paper, American Historians and the Democratic Idea, the neoconservative intellectual cited Ortega's fear of the mass man, whom Kristol described as, I quote, an individual who is not capable of assuming responsibility for self-limitation, for a kind of self-definition that is both generous and self-respecting. Interestingly enough, Kristol went on, Ortega's definition of the mass man is identical with Plato's definition of the tyrant. Note Kristol's interest in the inability of the mass man to limit himself, to practice that self-restraint which Kristol, following the American founders, took to be the prerequisite of effective democracy. The essays collected in Kristol's book, The Democratic Idea in America, published in 1972, exemplify this Republican, small r, Kristol. The founding fathers, Kristol wrote, saw democracy in America as resting upon two major pillars. The first is the new science of government, the Constitution. But the second is the spiritual order of Republican morality, of civic virtue, of Republican virtue. What the founders had constantly in mind, Kristol wrote, was, I quote, the willingness of the good democratic citizen on critical occasions to transcend the habitual pursuit of self-interest and devote himself directly and disinterestedly to the common good. Sacrifice, self-restraint, thrift, frugality, fidelity, comportment. The function of statecraft was to educate the individual in these virtues before he became absorbed in the democratic cacophony, before he became a mass man. The founding fathers, Kristol went on, and now, as I like to do, I will quote him at length. We're aware that in centuries past, democracy, in the sense of the unfettered rule of the demos, of the majority, had been one of the least stable and not always the most admirable of political regimes. And this awareness, Kristol continues, shared by practically all educated men of the time, caused them to devise a system that was more democratic than the mixed regimes that most political philosophers approved of, but also possessed at least some of the virtues thought to be associated with the mixed regime. Such virtues pertain not to the origins of government, but to its ends. And Kristol goes on, in establishing such a popular government, the founding fathers were certainly under the impression that they were expressing a faith in the common man, but they were sober and worldly men, and they were not about to hand out blank checks to anyone, even if he was a common man. They thought that political institutions had something to do with the shaping of common men, and they took the question, what kind of common man does our popular government produce, to be as crucial as a consideration as any other. Close quote. Like Buckley, Kristol drew a distinction between the procedures of democracy and its substance. The purpose of democracy cannot possibly be the endless functioning of its own political machinery, he wrote in the essay, Pornography, Obscenity, and the Case for Censorship. The purpose of any political regime, Kristol said, is to achieve some version of the good life and the good society. Kristol contrasted what he called the managerial conception of democracy as, quote, nothing but a set of rules and procedures, with an older idea of democracy as, I quote, a form of self-government, and that if you want it to be a meritorious polity, you have to care about what kind of people govern it. The people in this older version of democracy as self-government, quote, took some care not to let themselves be governed by the more infantile and irrational parts of themselves. close quote. But America, Crystal said, had long since transitioned from this Republican political philosophy to what Crystal called the transcendental populist religion of democracy. This religion holds that the source and origin of political power is more important than the existential consequences of this power, close quote. According to Crystal, it is a faith rather than a philosophy because it is not subject to rational inquiry. And in this faith, the mass man assumes a new guise as the populist common man. In his essays from the 1970s, Crystal is suspicious of such populism, since it came from both the radical New Left and from the New Right. Populism, he wrote in his essay, Corporate Capitalism in America, is, quote, an eternal problem for the American Democratic Republic, a problem, because it incarnates an antinomian impulse, a Jacobin contempt for the mere forms of law and order and civility. It also engenders an impulse toward a rather infantile political utopianism on the premise that nothing is too good for the people, close quote. And yet, when Crystal examined the tax revolt brewing in California in 1978, he noticed something interesting. Populist dissent today, he wrote, is directed against liberal politics, even when it votes for an anti-establishment liberal politician. This trend only grew more powerful with time. And it is interesting to consider that as Crystal himself became more of a capital R Republican, he became less of a small r Republican. The specter of the mass man faded from his writing. The mass man was replaced by the common man who, unlike liberals, possessed common sense and practical wisdom. By the beginning of Ronald Reagan's second term, Crystal was prepared to write a defense of the new populism. He urged his Wall Street Journal audience not to worry about populism because, quote, to the degree that we are witnessing a crisis in our democratic institutions, it is a crisis of our disoriented elites, not of a blindly impassioned populace, close quote. Centuries earlier, Edmund Burke had also noted that conservatism has much in common with the sentiments of ordinary men and women who prefer stability and tradition to social reconstruction according to abstract schemes. The perennial challenge for conservatives, especially for American ones, is to locate the meeting ground between public sentiments and public aspirations and the principles and institutions of the American founding. At this time, when the revolt of the public continues to upend social, cultural, and political institutions worldwide, it is worth becoming reacquainted with Gasset's concept of the mass man, the unmoored, overly stimulated, directionless individual whose nihilism is fuel for demagoguery and violence. Thank you.
All right, let's open this up for a conversation that'll be initially among ourselves and then open to our internet viewership, our virtual audience. I don't think any question I have for either of you is for only one of you. It makes sense for me to center and maybe begin some of them with one of you, given your sort of research and writing specialties, but don't hesitate to weigh in insofar as you have something to add, which I don't doubt both of you will on all of these. Let me start with a question about libertarians or classical liberals for you. Jennifer, I'm going to stick with first names since I know you both, if that's okay. I don't need to tell you that classical liberalism it has long been said, operates in a kind of regular tension with democracy. Because of its elevation of rights, which are understood to be, by their nature, designed to resist illiberal majoritarian impulses. Does that obviously could be said, Rand I'm less sure what to do with, whether to consider her more of a philosopher, more of a novelist, or more of a sort of a kind of political thinker, but as you yourself said, not really certainly not a democratic theorist. That posited tension between classical liberalism and democracy, does that strike you as justified, as exaggerated, as unsubstantiated, or what? And here I do not want us to get distracted by the case of historian Nancy McLean, but it's worth pointing out that her book about James Buchanan is only the most recent iteration of this claim, taken to the point of suggesting that there has been a pervasive kind of classical liberal who feels downright comfortable with authoritarianism and maybe downright uncomfortable with democracy by contrast. And I just wanted to know what you ultimately make of those claims.
So yeah, I mean, I'll pick up some of what I talked about in my talk. So there's kind of two moments when I see Friedman wrestling with this, and one is that the McCarthy era, and he really he was opposed to McCarthy. Yet he, at the same time, had a sense that there was going to be a limitation in how much the American public would be taken in by him. So he considered himself a civil libertarian. Interestingly enough, he felt the way to manage that was to engage and to essentially sort of fight the good fight against what he called the McCarthy-McCormick wing of the party. He was very aware there was an isolationist, anti-Semitic, anti-civil libertarian wing. So that was one place where he saw the need to defend the rights to free speech. After that, I would say most of his conception has to do with private property rights. That really is what it boils down. That's the right that he feels is threatened most by the growth in government. So that's really where he focuses most of his fire. In the beginning of his career, he is worried, as are many other classical liberals, that the state is going to try to intervene in the apparatus of economic production. Centralized planning is still a threat. Over time, he comes to see the real threat is simply taxation, which underwrites centralized planning in another way, because he says it pulls resources from individuals and then it's used to other ends that they haven't specifically chosen. So I think it's a thin concern about rights because, as I said, he feels so comfortable in the American system. But again, when he sees the argument being made that authoritarianism and capitalism somehow go together, he's like right against it. He's very concerned about that, and that is some ways his kind of worst nightmare. So if there's a concern with rights, it's mostly around property, but he's not willing to go to an authoritarian system to protect those rights. And I think what happens sometimes with Friedman is he gets collapsed with kind of others around him. Mm-hmm. And so I think you have to sort of take people on a case-by-case basis and understand, what are their fundamental concerns.
Is there a case to be made that, at least for Friedman, and I can imagine looking ahead and seeing some of these same issues being considered by Kristol and Buckley, that it's not a matter about an intrinsic tension, that it's about, in effect, sequencing, right? As a political scientist might be tempted to put it, that we know that there are discourses in which free marketeers have concluded that first get the economics right, and then the politics will follow. And at what some political scientists have referred to, usually somewhat critically, as the optimistic equation, this informed American foreign policy. Encourage economic growth, and in time, democratization will work itself through. Maybe that was because private property rights were foundational in some sense. They empowered individual citizens. They made them capable of self-rule, of resisting tyranny in some forms. Maybe it was because growth leads to a bigger middle class, and that's just inherently a better foundation for a moderate and stable democratic politics. But you pointed out already, Jennifer, a subtlety in Friedman. He clearly seems to start with that kind of sequencing in mind, but begins to wonder about the interaction between these two freedoms. But for either of you, how is that really an ongoing, not a dilemma, but just a problem, a puzzle to work out for fans of liberty and government?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dynamic can end up in a different place than where it starts. So it's kind of how do you keep it in the middle and not going to that extreme. So in the end of his career, Friedman gets more and more interested in things like constitutional limits on spending, constitutional limits on tax increases, a sort of super majoritarian, in some ways strengthening the democratic consent needed for the type of revenue collection that he feels is ultimately going to destabilize. And he really felt like a lot of people making decisions are not sort of understanding you can't spend over your tax base indefinitely, or there's going to be, as he would say, there's no free lunch, right? At some point you have to pay the bill. And his worry is that when it comes time to pay the bill, democracy might not be able to handle it, and then you kind of open yourself to movement to more undemocratic or potentially even authoritarian outcomes.
Yeah, I would say for the thinkers I discussed, and for conservatives more broadly, it's less the economic preconditions of democracy than the cultural and moral ones. And this debate came up.
So not economic preconditions? Sorry.
No,
Okay.
the more general,
Yeah.
What type of citizen is prepared to enter a democracy? And a democracy without the cultivated citizenry or a leadership class that it practices self-restraint, that appreciates civilizational heritage, democracy is likely to collapse into either anarchy or into tyranny. So that it's more broad than simple economic prerequisites. And we saw this too with the debates over President George W. Bush's freedom agenda, right? Who is ready for democracy? And many of the conservative opponents of George W. Bush's foreign policy made exactly this argument, that the populations being liberated by the American armed forces simply were not prepared as citizens to be small d Democrats.
Did those thinkers know how to describe what the right conditions were? I mean, for the economistically minded, it might be easy, right? We might say, I don't know, some threshold of income, or the size of a middle class measured in some way, or a diffusion of economic wealth within a society so that it's not highly polarized. I'm not saying that any one of those are right or that they would have had agreement on them, but at least it's not hard to describe those and to imagine measuring them. Did conservative thinkers who were focused, as you suggest, on moral and cultural issues, what's the description of what the right society is? Well, the right for democratic stability.
It typically had to do with liberal education. And so for a thinker like Albert J. Nock or for Irving Babbitt, you would cultivate a leadership class through education in the classics. Even for the philosopher Leo Strauss, a true liberal education would create gentlemen who would be able to practice democracy in ways that would not lead to its end. So I think for conservatives, it has this question of education has always loomed large, because that would be the way. It wasn't an economic precondition. And the conservatives I'm discussing were less interested in economics, right? They were interested in culture and tradition and morality. But they felt that liberal education was the way to prepare citizens for democracy.
So is the equivalent concern here, would one warning sign on the dashboard here not be claims about Friedman or Buchanan and authoritarian regimes, but rather, say, some of the National Review crowd who may have seen in Franco's Spain the creation of a moral basis for a better society?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the temptation for conservatism, is to locate this moral order in regimes that are authoritarian, and of course, in the context of the Cold War, many conservatives were made compromises with authoritarianism as allies against the larger threat of the Soviet Union. And so this complicates the relationship between conservatives and democracy as well, because as the United States engaged in the Cold War, many conservatives, including Buckley, including Crystal, were willing to support authoritarian regimes to the larger goal of defeating communism.
The formulation that I originally asked you about, Jennifer, that classical liberals and libertarians have often been said to operate in tension with democracy because they elevate rights that are designed to resist majoritarian impulses or momentary majoritarian illiberal instincts. Wouldn't that apply equally logically to modern liberalism, to today's liberals and progressives? I appreciate that contemporary, or for the last 75 years, liberals and progressives have cherished different rights than libertarians or than classical liberals, less private property, more other kinds of things. But to the extent that they too elevate rights, should we be equally open to interpreting that as a kind of source of mixed feelings about democracy, not just populism, but democracy itself. And let me give one historical example that will, I think, appeal to the sort of historically minded in both of you, and a more contemporary one. The historically minded one is the rights that liberals obviously wanted to help achieve for African Americans in the United States, the civil rights era, desegregating schools and much else, but that in at least large parts of the South obviously were calls that were in defiance of what were locally, no doubt, electoral majorities. And they were content, and what would be the snarky way to put it today, they were content to hide behind the skirts of an anti-majoritarian institution or counter-majoritarian institution like the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board. And fast forward many decades, their elevation of rights like to marriage equality or to same-sex marriage also were done in defiance of what were at the time, no doubt, electoral majorities or potential majorities. And they preferred that issue not be resolved that way, and that it instead were content for it to be resolved in Obergefell. Should we interpret modern liberalism's, not classical, but modern liberalism's relationship with democracy? I appreciate we're not typically discursively in the habit of doing so, but should we be? Of also wondering how much of a skepticism, hesitation, set of mixed feelings were present there as well?
I mean, I think it is a tension, right? There's tension. Rights can be in conflict. So one person can claim a right that conflicts with another's right. So in some ways there have to be judgments made. And then of course we're in a system that tries to elevate rights and also tries to have democratic processes. So absolutely they do clash. And then you have to sort of sort through what is the right way to approach it, no pun intended. And so, I mean, yeah, one thing that is interesting about Friedman is, when it comes to the case of segregation, he was not on the barricades fighting segregation despite freedom being his most stated vow. So I think this goes back to the fact that he didn't see political freedom, it sort of didn't foreground it for much of his career. So the fact of mass disenfranchisement in the South didn't register for him as a rights violation. In the same way as he felt that some of the laws, he went along the sort of Goldwater line for the Civil Rights Act would, inhibit private property rights or the choice of free association or the choice of who to hire. I find that just sort of a troubling lacuna in his thought. I haven't been able to find much of what he had to say, if anything, about the Voting Rights Act. So when it came to rights in the South, he was really thinking, I think, again, in terms of property rights, in terms of economic rights, and then with this sort of undue optimism that discrimination would sort of fade out. Here, I think it's really important to think about him as someone who, a Jewish American who had seen prejudice against Jews sort of tumble extremely rapidly in his own lifetime. He just had a different sense of what the obstacles were in the South and in the country more broadly.
Yeah, I hate to sound cynical, but a lot of it has to do with which institutions the left or right controls at a given time. So at the kind of the prehistory of the thinkers that we discussed today, pre-New Deal, right, when the right in many ways was in ascendance, or was just kind of the air that America breathed, economic liberty was judicially enforced. And this was something that was strongly held among the conservatives.
Even in the face of some electoral opposition?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And indeed lamented to the loss of it, lamented to this day. As liberalism became more fixed to the judiciary and the bureaucracy, conservatives then took their populist turn, right? And so they find themselves outside of those institutions, beginning with FDR, and only, ever really until Reagan, for the entirety of that period. And so they're criticizing kind of the modern liberal idea of rights that are judicially enforced. And today we have an interesting case where the right is now in control of the Supreme Court. And so you begin to see now a debate within conservatism over, this idea of so-called judicial engagement or judicially enforced rights. Well, as long as they are originalist in intent and, they further the cause of liberty or they maybe that's not such a bad idea, right? So I think it has a lot to do with the place that conservatives find themselves in any given moment, which makes sense since history is change.
All right, so the usual cynical observation is that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Maybe the way to think about it here is that if you're confronted by a lot of nails, you start looking around for a hammer. And in these cases, you've all started us on this with his opening comments that the perceptions of illegitimacy of sitting presidents, tends to be voiced by people who are in the opposing party and didn't want them to be president. That you're not inventing new ground here. This is right. People like what they like what beats their opponents, and they don't like it when their opponents win, and they look for tools to try to achieve that. That makes me want to ask you, Matt, particularly, both of you, but let me start with Matt, about this changing relationship with populism over time. As you point out, this is not the first time that the current events in the United States are not the first time conservatives have grappled with this. Eisenhower was not satisfying to National Review conservatives, but he demonstrated that a certain kind of not very left politics could be extremely popular if harnessed, if put in harness behind the right candidate, for example. Reagan obviously had populist elements to him. There were figures on the right that today, I'm sure most of us would consider. I'm probably going to get heck for this in comments from some audience members, but in the 1970s, Richard Viguerie, Howard Phillips, Paul Weyrich, they were not considered fringe figures, even if now they're minor figures in the conservative pantheon. They seem to have been, this is maybe me more editorializing than knowing it, as well as either of you would, but they had been struck by George Wallace's amazing potential to realign an electorate. They were obviously impressed by Reagan's ability to do so, and they called themselves a kind of populist new right that they thought was going to just lend a much more earthy, average citizen tone to political events. And are we seeing in our current moment, is there a consistency to this history, or would that be just an act of us imposing it retrospectively that these are all of occurrence, these are all of some tendency?
Right. Well, I'd just start by saying there are different ways of telling the story of conservatism in America. There's kind of the linear progression, which I think is the way that it's mainly told. First you have Buckley, then you have Goldwater, then you have Reagan, and la-di-da, right? Then there's a more complicated contested narrative where you see that the right has always been multifaceted and is always arguing with itself, and at some points some elements are in ascendance and others are in descent, right? And occasionally those are more populist elements, and other times they are more classically liberal ones, say. I sometimes like to think of it as tidal, that you have these waves of populism that kind of sweep over the conservative movement in American politics at large and then eventually recede. And you really have seen the beginning of this, or at least I locate it, in the post-war era with the rise of McCarthy, who was popular for several years, right? And it was really the first moment after the Second World War that conservatives found, hey, these people agree with us. Of course, we know how that ended. And we know how Wallace ended. And we have subsequent waves. I'll just asterisk Reagan for a moment. We have the Buchanan wave. We have the Trump wave. What I think, and this is one of the themes of my book, the history of the right is often distorted through the lens of Reagan. Yeah. Because that linear story always culminates in him. And yet he's such a unique figure with exceptional talents, but also kind of an opacity to him that enabled every single figure on the right, except for the fringe, to identify their concerns in him, right? So the new right had no problem with him. They want to take credit with him. National Review, of course, wants to take credit for him. When he won and Buckley was asked what job Buckley would like in the administration, Buckley said, ventriloquist. But the neocons also claim credit for him and through supply-side economics. So I think we have to kind of, I don't say this because he's a titanic figure. We don't want to diminish him, but we have to kind of locate him in a much larger picture. And when we do that, we see that this struggle over the place of populism within conservatism and within American politics is enduring and is not going to go away.
Do you want to tackle the
Yeah, I would just add on to that.
Actually, let me interrupt, not because I don't want the conversation to go on, because I precisely want it to go on. It's been recommended, and it's a good idea, that I remind viewers, virtual viewers, that you can send questions via email to Nicole, Nicole, Nicole.penn, Penn, @aei.org, or via Twitter at #AEI conservatism. And I encourage you to send in questions you may have.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on a bit to that. I also agree that one thing that really surprised me was see how active Friedman was at different points in his career, trying to fight against what we would call a populist right, create an alternative, sometimes trying to create it through his very person as a Jewish academic who was going to take up space in this movement and thereby push others out. There was the 50s fight against the McCarthy wing in Chicago. He's very aware of the Chicago Tribune, right? This kind of last blast of the conservative media titans. Then the John Birch Society. The first sort of time that he and Buckley connect is when Buckley tries to push the Birchers out of National Review. He's very fond of that. But then let's fast forward to Reagan and a bit beyond, because I think there's something there as well. Because you have in Reagan, all these different factions feeling like their dreams have come true. And then sort of what happens now. And with Friedman, it was a bit of a disappointment that the growth of government had been slowed, but there wasn't anything akin to, say, Thatcherism in the UK, in which you can sort of see the state shrink in meaningful ways. And so it's kind of a puzzle for him in his last years. He's a bit cranky about it, but you start to see a bit, he basically decides, well, divided government is the way to go, because then nobody can get anything done, and I can't count on the Republicans to do what I want to do. And so he doesn't articulate it in the same modality, say, as Rush Limbaugh would, but there's a bit of frustration, and I think that's the beginning of the curdling and the sort of anger at, even if we control the apparatus of the state, it's not doing what we want. And so then I think you get a more angry populism and a breach between this establishment that's now come into power under these certain set of ideals, but they're not doing what we want. So we've been betrayed. Mm-hmm. So you have the beginning, you have the ingredients for a feeling of sort of anger and betrayal. And an audience that can be brought in around those ideas. Even if Friedman doesn't do it, I can see, he's part of the establishment. He's not going to turn on it, but I can see his disappointment and see where that potentially leads.
We've been talking about the extent to which conservatives in different periods and different factions within the broader right, how they feel about rights, which rights, the role that they think sort of mass man ought or ought not to play in politics, populism, and however that might be defined. Have we been talking for the last hour about support for democracy or anti-democratic sentiments? Can we really identify anti-democratic actions, thoughts, elaborated belief systems, behaviors, preferences on the broader American right in the, say, post-1945 period, or whenever you would want to demarcate our conversation? Anybody who simply doesn't, not anybody, I'm not looking for an individual voice somewhere, but rather a substantial sentiment whereby elections just ought not to be the way that collective decisions get made, or there may be more refined, subtle versions of properly said anti-democraticness. Someone, I forget who, argued yesterday in Ross Douthat's column that there may be conservatives may be cautious at times about who gets the vote, because maybe my wording here, they presume that who gets the vote gets to decide things. Whereas liberals may be more comfortable in modern times with lots of people voting, because they actually don't intend entirely for the voter to always end up deciding. They see a lot of room for expertise to buffer, to be insulated from electoral impulses, whether in public school curricula or a lot else. But however exactly we're going to define anti-democraticness, do we really see an ongoing issue here when we really put it that sharply?
Well, to the degree that the conservatives value American institutions and the Constitution and the founding and view their job as the defense of those practices and traditions, no, because you're going to have some you're going to have some reliance on popular government. That is America, right? You may have skepticism about majoritarian democracy, which I think is a constant, especially among the thinkers I discussed. But at the end of the day, you're still going to support small r republicanism and constitutionalism. However, there have been plenty of thinkers on the right, including Americans, who turn against the Constitution. In the 1930s, when the radical tide was rising on both left and right, there was a publication called The American Review. It was edited by this very odd man named Seward Collins. And Collins was a dilettante. He published Southern Agrarians, right? Reactionaries of all stripes. He published Catholic Distributists. He published the Henry George Single Taxers. And then he became really interested in fascism. And eventually his magazine fell apart because he became a supporter of Hitler. In the late 60s and 70s, there were debates in National Review, attacks on the so-called fusion theory of conservatism, where you balance tradition and liberty, where a political theorist who's teaching in Canada named Donald Atwell-Zoll was making the case for authoritarianism in the pages of National Review against Frank Meyer. I love this story because it ends, it turns out that Zoll's had plagiarized his thesis and he lost his faculty position and then he became an elephant trainer. So my point being, and of course we know today that there are figures on the right who are turning against the Constitution, who are turning against liberal democracy and its American guise, and who are embracing, Catholic Empire, for example, right, as an alternative. So this is a constant temptation. But in the main, I think if you're a conservative who views the American conservatives' job to defend American institutions, then you have to defend popular government.
Yeah, I mean, it breaks down when you come to the civil rights era in the South, and you have sins of omission and sins of commission. And the sin of omission is we have an authoritarian sub-state in a region of the United States that conservatives are not really making a major moral or political problem. So that's the sin of omission. And the sin of commission is this talk about states' rights and to elevate states' rights over individual rights and access to democratic processes. And that, I think, is sometimes left out of the kind of synthesis of conservatism. If you look at Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, this very classic text, I mean, there's whole chapters on states' rights. And he's always like, well, it's about the funding streams and states should have, it's also talking about what are the rights of the states to restrict the franchise in anti-democratic ways. So I think that's where you have to think about how wide do the ideals go, who are they applied to, what are the blind spots. And there's room for change and growth and improvement, but it's also important to recognize where bad judgments were made. And so I think that's kind of the soft spot that's hard to wrestle with. And we could say it's not applicable today, but we could also say that those are long traditions. Restricting the franchise in certain states are really long traditions, and we have to ask, are those still in play? And if they're not, then let's set those goals to rest, but I think that still needs to be incorporated.
Okay. At the risk, in that sense, of allowing non-experts in the audience to join the fray, let's enrich the conversation with this. I'm seeing some of the comments that are being sent in, and let me sort of do some selecting among them, which I promise not to do abusively. One viewer, Matt, asks a question about Buckley. He writing that it strikes me, as this viewer puts it, that a major through line in Buckley's public and private writings in the 1950s and 60s is a belief in a kind of natural ruling class, maybe consisting particularly of men like himself. Can you talk about the role of social class in his attitudes towards democracy and of the conservative movement writ large, not just Buckley?
Economic class.
Would this be considered a kind of Tory sensibility?
Yeah,
that they were natural
yes, but it's
governors?
It's complicated by Buckley's heritage. I like to describe Buckley as an insider-outsider. So he was born to wealth, right? But he was also Catholic. So he didn't fit within the WASP's power structure of his day. He went to Yale, but he was an arch conservative, and his first book was an attack on this institution, right? He felt outside of the same institutions he inhabited. He became a celebrity, a media celebrity, but of course, he was always kind of part of that media culture of the mid-20th century, but kind of a exotic creature, that easily caricatured, as many people did. Did he love wealth? Yes. Did he think that the free enterprise system was going to lead to economic inequality? Yes. And he defended it as the result of liberty, as an inevitable result of liberty. So it's fascinating because many of the arguments on the right today, among the new right in particular, go to this question of economic class and class conflict. That was foreign to Buckley. He didn't analyze things in that way. To the degree that he thought there should be a conservative ruling class, it was going to be a class that was educated in Buckleyism, in his principles, and in this idea that there's transcendental truths that we should follow. Crystal, on the other hand, was much more interested in class, maybe coming from his background as a former Trotskyist, right? Seeped it in Marxism, right? And so when the tax revolt breaks out in California in the late 1970s, he immediately, in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, which I think he enjoyed doing, analyzed it as a class conflict, right? Though for him, especially toward that end, it wasn't so much a defense of the upper class or the high class. It was a defense of the working class, a defense of the ordinary people, the common people who had common sense. So I guess that's how I'd answer that question about class.
We've talked about Buckley a fair amount. To focus on Crystal for a moment, is there a tension between the fact that he was obviously he was much more of an outsider by history, by sociology than, you can correct me in a moment. Let me finish my flawed thought, and then you can settle accounts. I was going to say that he was much more an outsider than Buckley by birth and upbringing and so on, but he was also in tone in the work that surrounded him and the work he cultivated in the pages of the public interest, much more interested in expertise than Buckley was. He didn't run a rambunctious, freewheeling, somewhat humorous, pugilistic magazine. He ran something much more highbrow.
Right. Well, I think that gets to the question of origins. But Buckley, just to start, Buckley loved expertise in its place. In fact, there's a great column he wrote in the 80s about that's simply called, it's titled "A Conversation with Milton Friedman." And Buckley, who was always on deadline, he wrote these columns 3 times a week, sometimes in an hour or less, and it shows, simply called Friedman up on the phone and transcribed the conversation. That was the column. So he was happy to rely on Milton Friedman in that instance. So unlike Buckley, who came from inherited wealth and grew up in this mansion in Sharon, Connecticut, and went to private schools, Crystal, of course, the son of immigrants and working class background, goes to City College, which is free. At the same time, though, by the time they reach maturity, Crystal is much more embedded in the intellectual and political culture of America than Buckley ever was, in a weird way, pre-Reagan, right? Because the neoconservatives, they were Democrats. They were liberals. They were the liberals mugged by reality. And they had journals like The Public Interest, which relied on liberal social scientists who were just beginning to question the results of all these grand policies that had been enacted in the 1960s. So he was more, I think, weirdly, Irving ended up more of an insider than Buckley, who, despite his harpsichord and his television shows and introducing Masterpiece Theater on PBS,
you could have stopped at harpsichord.
Well, you can never stop with William F. Buckley. There's so much to say.
You've referred to Irving Kristol's background, Jewish as well. You've referred to that in Milton Friedman's biography. I suspect that if 75 or more years ago, a panel like this had been thinking about conservatism over the coming decades, you would have assumed it would be grounded in America's sort of, mediast, middle and upper middle class stock, Protestant, middle American, and so on. And certain titanic figures do represent that. Ronald Reagan, no, child of privilege, but nonetheless came from sort of the demographic meaty middle of the United States. But what should it tell us, if anything? What does it mean that a lot of the right's intellectual heft ended up coming from neoconservatives who were Jewish, and free marketeers and economists who you can't call Friedman a neoconservative, of course, but just intellectuals who happen to be of Jewish background. And on the other hand, something that one of our afternoon panelists, Patrick Allett, knows a lot more about than I do, which is the enormous eventual influence of Catholic thinking, jurisprudential thinking, among other things, on modern conservatism. These were not insiders. These were minority groups. In the case of Catholics, a substantial minority group. But nonetheless, does this matter? Should we read anything into this?
I mean, I think the quickest answer is there was a hegemony, a Protestant hegemony for a long time. So those who grew up outside of it became very critical of it, and when it stumbled, they had an alternative. So I think that's kind of the biggest macro level way to think of it. I think, when I think about Friedman, because he did experience such a remarkable period of social openness, I think that was part of his optimism, and that also colored how he saw the world, and that was also part of why when he went to other parts of the world that had sort of feudalism still in action, his ideas didn't map quite as easily, and he was sometimes taken aback to see how live ideas of social hierarchy were in other ways that were much more evident to him than they were in the United States.
I'd say first it testifies to the remarkable power of assimilation of this country. That conservatism, which is typically identified with the high and mighty, can absorb immigrant energies, outside energies, Catholicism, Jews, right? The blue-collar conservatism that comes into being in the late 60s and early 70s. Today, the head of the Hoover Institution is a black woman. The president of the Manhattan Institute is the son of immigrants from Bangladesh. The lead figure on the Catholic New Right is the son of an immigrant from Iran. So you can see this power of America, despite all the criticisms of American immigration policy and integration policy, America just is this engine that just keeps on pulling these different traditions in. The second thing is, I'm glad you brought up the neocons. We didn't really discuss this in the panel as it relates to democracy, but one of the reasons that I talked about Buckley in my speech. Buckley ended up becoming kind of the main view, or the National Review view of civil rights, but it was not the sole view on these questions. Buckley's cultural grounds for opposing civil rights was opposed by his former debate partner and brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, who went with Goldwater on just simply being very personally pro-civil rights, but against federal intervention on constitutional grounds. A sin of omission, as Jennifer said. The Straussians, the followers of Leo Strauss, they had no problem with the federal government inserting itself in the state business. And so you find not only Straussians like Martin Diamond and Walter Burns, but most famously Harry Jaffa, the founder of the so-called Claremont School of Conservatism, in the 1960s, fighting in the pages of National Review with pro-Southern intellectuals like Mel Bradford, right? So it's important, I think, to contextualize even that piece of the debate that you mentioned, the civil rights debate, is that here too, the variegated American conservatism had different perspectives. And there were, this was in fact the obstacle to many neocons joining the conservative movement, because Goldwater had voted against the Civil Rights Act. And it wasn't until affirmative action, until mandatory busing, that the neoconservatives said, well, this isn't about equal opportunity, this isn't about color blindness, but it's about a form of judicially enforced color-conscious politics that is harmful to America and harmful to individual achievement.
A viewer asks, are our modern institutions no longer in effect absorbent of new ideas? I mean, both of you have been talking about and studying the role that ideas played in politics, presumably not just something that emanated outward into the society, but that were also directed. Friedman, Buckley, and Crystal were all people who very deliberately aimed their belief systems at decision makers. The ventriloquist imagery may be a little over the top, but they were all trying to influence. And a viewer asks whether our institutions today have become more where places where ideas go to die rather than being actually receptive to or absorbent of transmission belts, actively helping shape their activities.
When they founded the Heritage Foundation, Joe Coors and Ed Fellner were very interested in what they called the decision-making loop. That idea that Stu Anderson would come up with an idea, and then they would shop it to Congress, and within a few months, George Will would be writing about empowerment zones, right? And mastering that decision-making loop was the aim of the Heritage Foundation, right. And it was the way that Washington really worked, I think, for about 25 years. I think that loop is broken. But I don't think that means that institutions are no longer receptive to ideas, or that institutions can't shape eventual decision makers. And here I would point to the Federalist Society as one of the most successful institutions of the American conservative movement in having a role in acculturating generations of lawyers and judges in constitutionalism and in originalism. And you see the effect, I think, of it. I mentioned the Claremont Institute. I think you see the power of the Claremont Institute today in shaping the debates that are occurring on the new right. Not that I agree with them.
Yeah. Professor Burns, the last word.
So I think that is still there, as Matt said. It's harder to see because we have a very crowded media environment. And we also have the rise of political entrepreneurship. Now, this is part of the decline of traditional party structures. It's interesting. We think of a figure like Jack Kemp, who was one of the first political entrepreneurs. He had a celebrity profile as a football player, but he also grabbed an idea, supply side, and he kind of rode that up the ranks. I think you see now people are coming out more in terms of personality. The political entrepreneurs no longer have to grab an idea to go somewhere. They can grab a mood. They can grab a sensibility. They can simply put forward their own celebrity. So we're just in a different celebrity culture. I think that idea network is still there. It's hard to see, and sometimes it's completely overridden by this other circuit of celebrity, political entrepreneurship, and sort of the quest for eyeballs and attention and focus in the media.
We've actually gotten 89 minutes into an 90-minute session before even a pretty clear reference to Donald J. Trump. Are we really going to end this panel without any explicit reference to him?
Yes.
All right, in that case, what are we going to do for the next 30 seconds if we're not going to ask? Any last word? This goes to you now on the contemporary and coming relevance of these themes.
Sorry, I'm going to punt over.
I mean, the debate is ongoing, and I think because of the nature of media and the trends that Jennifer just mentioned, the role of institutions and elites within the conservative movement has been greatly diminished. And so what form conservatism will take in the coming years, we do not know, but we do know that it will be more populist than it has been. Maybe not at the past 5 years, but certainly was, say, at the turn of the 21st century. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, we've talked about a whole range of figures here, and, some of them wrote things that are worth revisiting today. I like to say a book is a gift that keeps on giving. Every time you read it, it's like it was written anew. And so I would just say there's resources beyond the sound bites and the tweets to have some deeper thinking about what are the patterns we're in, and what is our capacity to shape them and to propose new alternatives and new syntheses, I think is really, the new often comes from a blending of the old and the changed circumstances we're in.
Thank you both. Thank you, AEI. Thank you, UVA. And we'll see you at our second session.
Thank you.
Welcome back to our second panel of the day, the right and the politics of democracy. Before we start, I thought I'd just tell a quick story. I'm Mary Kate Carey, your moderator for the second half here. I'm a speechwriter by trade, and I own a book called On This Spot in Washington, and I use it for speeches around town. And I had to look up the other day, I was writing for a speech on this same block, and it turns out that here in this fabulous building that we're in at AEI, back in the day it used to be 6 very grand apartments in this entire building. And one of the apartments was Andrew Mellon, the great philanthropist, and one of the apartments was lived in by an art dealer. And the art dealer went on vacation and handed his apartment keys to Andrew Mellon and said, could you do me a favor? Could you keep an eye on my apartment while I'm gone? And Andrew Mellon did, and went down one night and saw this spectacular collection of art in the other guy's apartment. And so he made an offer on the spot, bought every piece of art in the apartment, and that became the basis for the National Gallery of Art. And that's where it all started, was here in this building. And I thought maybe there's some way to say, great things happen here in this building, and this could be the birth of not just art galleries, but fabulous live streaming on conservative thought as well. So I'm glad to be here, and thank you to AEI for having us. Let me introduce our 2 guests here. On the end there is Ross Douthat. He is a non-resident fellow here at the AEI Institute, at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies American politics, culture, religion, and family life. He has been an opinion columnist for the New York Times since 2009, writing about a variety of current political, religious, and moral issues every Tuesday and Sunday. He's a prolific writer. He's written for The Atlantic, for the National Review, has been published widely in the popular press. He is the author of 5 books, but the most important for our conversation today is not the most recent, it's actually one of your older ones, called The Grand New Party, How Republicans Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. And he co-authored that with Rihan Salam in 2008. You have a BA from Harvard. And then to my right is Patrick Allett, Cahoon Family Professor of American History at Emory University. Received his undergraduate degree from Oxford in England, his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and then held postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard Divinity and Princeton University. Since 1988 at Emory, Professor Allett teaches courses on American intellectual, environmental, and religious history, on Victorian Britain, and on the great books. He's the author of 7 books, but most importantly for today's discussion, The Conservatives, Ideas and Personalities Throughout American History, published in 2009. He is the presenter of 8 different lecture series, but that does not mean 8 lectures. That means dozens and dozens and dozens of lectures with the great courses. So he is a household name in many houses, I think, across the United States. The great courses offer college-level audio and video courses online, including, the best of all, in our opinion, the conservative tradition, which you teach. So those are our introductions for our talk today. And I thought I would start, as our audience just heard, both of you wrote histories of conservative thought, and both books ended around 2008, 2009, in the early 2000s. So let's start with sort of big picture. When you look at the state of our democracy, what do you think the biggest developments have been in conservative politics since the ends of your books, basically, since the early 2000s? So, Patrick, if I may call you that.
Yes, of course.
Why don't you start us off?
Okay. Well, since that book came out in 2009, there have been 3 presidential elections, and they've been won by 3 different individuals. And the parties have reciprocated. And in the same way, the control of the Houses of Congress has gone back and forth between the 2 parties. And so has the dominance of the state governments. So I think that's a prima facie evidence of our democracy being in good shape, that the voters have the opportunity and take the opportunity to throw the rascals out and to bring in the other group, and that the electoral system has continued to work relatively well. Obviously, it's been under a lot of stress, particularly during the Trump administration. But when I think about the events of immediately following Trump's or Biden's victory at the end of 2020 and the January 6th riot of early 21. Although it was a dismaying event, in some ways I take comfort from the fact that none of the rioters appeared to have had an alternative theory of government. Nobody went there saying, now it's time to overthrow democracy. They seem to have talked themselves into the idea that, in fact, the democratic verdict of the voters was being violated, and that what they were trying to do was to restore a principle of democracy which was in jeopardy. I think they were completely wrong in saying it, but nevertheless, the fact that that's how they thought about it seems to me encouraging. It's also been very encouraging to see the way in which the rule of law has prevailed, so that many of them are now being prosecuted. That also seems to me appropriate and a very good thing. So I'm surrounded, particularly by my faculty colleagues, by people who are extremely pessimistic about the future of American democracy. But it's a view I disagree with. I mean, one of the things that astonished me when I came to live in America for the first time was the reverence with which democracy was treated here. In Britain, it's a practical system for getting a government, but nobody ever rhapsodizes about democracy. Whereas here, it's widespread and commonplace. And I think all over the political spectrum, you find people who are very, very serious about it. In Georgia, the state where I currently live, the Republican Secretary of State resisted pressure from Trump to pervert the course of the election. And he was under a lot of pressure to do so. So all credit to him for doing that. All these seems to me to be very encouraging signs. Taking the longer view, when I think about the history of conservatism and the history of democracy, there's always been a conservative skepticism about it. Certainly before the Civil War, Americans with conservative dispositions were very dubious about it and would often talk about democracy as being a kind of gangrene, which was a sort of this horrifying affront to the welfare of the republic. Probably the biggest change came about during the Cold War when American conservatives said, we conservatives we're representatives of the free world. What's free about it? Well, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and the right to choose our own government. So at that point, they became very wholehearted about the idea that freedom was actually synonymous with democracy. So there we are. I think I'm optimistic by temperament, and it seems to me that despite serious problems, we've got a lot to feel pleased about.
So I did check the clock as you were speaking. The previous panel went for 89 minutes before President Trump's name came up, and I think we got it at the 6-minute mark. So we're off to the races. Ross, what do you think has happened since the publication of your book? What are the biggest movements?
So I'll say one optimistic thing, which is that I agree with Patrick that the overall condition of democracy is better than most of his colleagues believe it to be. Mm-hmm. And then I'll say some more pessimistic things about the state of conservatism. I think that Patrick alluded to it, and there was a lot of discussion of it in the first panel. But there's sort of this interesting tension when you think about American right-wing politics over the last 50, 60, 70 years, which is the tension between a sort of intellectual conservatism that, for various reasons in various schools, regards democracy sort of in its purest form with suspicion. And this can take a sort of traditionalist form of sort of skepticism of mob rule. It can take a libertarian form of fear of sort of political interference with the workings of the market. We had a lot of discussion about sort of Milton Friedman and his views on that score. And it can take a kind of small r Republican view, a sort of reverence for the separation of powers, for sort of counter-majoritarian institutions, the intricate workings of the Constitution. All of these are part of the inheritance of contemporary conservatism in the United States. But then so is this experience of being a kind of populist mass movement that won commanding presidential level majorities under Richard Nixon, under Ronald Reagan, under George H.W. Bush, amazingly enough, thanks mostly to his speechwriters.
Thank you very much.
And yes, and that aspect of conservatism has always sort of identified itself with some version of the common man, the ordinary American, pitted against the sort of machinations of elites who went to Ivy League schools and work in the federal bureaucracy or opine for the New York Times. Present company. Yeah. And so those are sort of both aspects of sort of what you might call the conservative tradition in America, and certainly both aspects of right-wing politics today. The problem right now, I think, is that for a variety of reasons, American conservatism as a political force has sort of dead-ended at a position where it kind of has the worst of both of those tendencies operating in it at the same time. So on the kind of populist side of things, in the era of Trump, and I'm really glad the first panel left all of Trump era terrain
Yes.
for us to navigate. But in the era of Trump, conservative politics has become, in certain ways, much more small d democratic than it ever was before, in the sense that sort of elite rules of, sort of politesse and, the norms of political rhetoric and conduct have been, either smashed or left by the wayside. And Trumpism in various ways represents a kind of, reality television, pop culture version of conservatism that is very of the people in a way that conservative politics, even under Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, has not been in the past. But it doesn't actually command Democratic majorities. It has sort of repeatedly stalled out at 47%, 48%, 49%. And so you have a movement that has, sort of what from a traditional conservative perspective were some of the more dubious features of democratic culture, a sort of lowbrow wrestling match style of politics without the benefit of actually gaining enough votes to be able to claim a real mandate to govern the country. And then obviously this sort of takes its sharpest form then in the Trump's own election fraud narrative, where this sort of tension was resolved by saying, well, actually, we do command a majority. The Democrats just, sort of stole it from us. And I think it's very challenging to do effective governance out of that combination, where you sort of have convinced yourself, including in your own self-presentation, that you speak for the people, but you don't actually speak for enough of the people to govern as Reagan or prior Republican presidents did. And then on the other side of conservatism, right, the wisest or most plausible version, I think, of the conservative skepticism about democracy has always been the idea that wise governance has to be channeled through some kind of elite. You can't have any society without some kind of elite, some kind of governing class. But conservatives have never found a way to actually become the governing class in the United States. And all of the different plans and projects to achieve that, whether Buckleyite or neoconservative or George W. Bushian, have sort of come to naught. And if anything, the American elite writ large is more hostile to conservatives than at any point in the past. And so the sort of counter-majoritarian side of conservatism thus comes to rest not in sort of the wise stewardship of small r Republican elites, but in gerrymanders and the filibuster, these sort of structural features that for a variety of reasons have ended up benefiting conservatives a bit more, but are mostly just tools of gridlock. Which again, if you're just trying to stop an unfortunate liberal agenda is not the worst thing in the world, but out of those tools, it's very hard, similarly, to sort of craft a governing agenda. Again, if you don't have the personnel who would actually need to staff bureaucracies, run administrations, and so forth. So those are, I think, two ways, or maybe one conjoined way, in which these two aspects of conservatism are both very much in evidence right now in different ways, but are not necessarily making American conservatism as a whole a particularly healthy force in American politics and government right now.
I think there's so much there to unpack. But I think we're going to come back to, I think, some of the more current, news of the week kind of stuff. But for a second, let's go to Patrick and some of the work you've done on the tension over time, and Ross, you're more of the current tension between conservatism and populism. And in your opinion, has the American political right ever been truly conservative? Like, how would you?
Well, that implies that there's a kind of definition of conservatism to which everybody would agree, and I think that's not true. That in different eras, the word itself has meant very different things. I was very struck in doing the research for that book, The Conservatives, that certain figures like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton at certain times have been the heroes of later generations of both radicals and of conservatives. That if you think that small government is important, Jefferson's going to look like a highly attractive figure. On the other hand, there are periods when conservatives, for various structural reasons, have wanted government to be more powerful, and then they've looked back to the heritage of Alexander Hamilton. And then, of course, conservatism is different again in the British context than in the American one. But, I mean, as Ross said, there's no question that conservatism nearly always implies the rule by an elite. And so although the elites who've run conservative politics have been validated by the electorate, they've never romanced the electorate. Or let's put it this way. I remember so clearly that when I first came to America, I read an article within a few weeks of getting here by Samuel Huntington, and this was written in the early 70s, and he was talking about the progressive ungovernability of society. And he said, why is that? Because too many people are involved in the democratic process. And he was taking issue with the concept of participatory democracy and saying, it's a dreadful idea. Obviously, this was the great thing for the New Left at the time. But he said it's a terrible thing because the more people who are involved, it means that when an issue comes up over which reasonable people can disagree, the more people you have voting on the issue, the more are going to end up on the narrowly losing side and are going to have actively opposed the decision which is finally made. And they're going to be that much more cranky and cantankerous about it.
Sort of the red tie versus green tie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd never thought about that before. I mean, I'd also grown up in this utopian cloud, assuming that, of course, it's good for people to vote. Then I realized, no, actually, it's not, because it's so hard to learn about the issues. Most of them have got to be delegated into the hands of elites. And when you start finding a reluctance to delegate in that way, that leads to instability.
Now, just before I get to you, Ross, I did circle, because we have many viewers here from the University of Virginia, that you had a line in your book about Jefferson, since you just mentioned him. You were saying that as people reconsider that things over the years, the passage of time could also bring about odd reconfigurations, such as the elevation of Thomas Jefferson, once dreaded as a dangerous radical, but then he became the hero of anti-big government Southern conservatives in the 20th century, and how things changed like that. But Jefferson, I think, is a great example of being a bellwether at different times in our history.
Yeah, and in fact, it's changed again now, because I remember that when I first became a professor back in the late 80s, everybody assumed, of course, Jefferson's a good thing. I mean, he was one of the gods. But now he's regarded by many students as a devil figure, because they regard him as a sexual predator against Sally Hemings, and his failure to free his slaves, and obviously the DNA evidence was conclusive.
Right.
So you no longer find reverence for Jefferson, even though he was the author of the Declaration of Independence and contributed in such a vital way to the origins of the Republic. So that's another dimension I wasn't even thinking about then.
Right, but arguably, all men are created equal. The greatest 5 words in the last 1,000 years that have liberated people all over the world. I'm a little biased, but anyway. So Ross, what's your sense of it? Do you think the American political right has ever truly been conservative, or has it evolved over time, like Patrick's saying, that it's different things at different times?
Well, I mean, I think there's truth to the sort of truism that there is a style of conservatism, a kind of traditionalist conservatism that has at best barely been at home in American politics. And in that sense, all of our politics has been some variation on small L liberal, with the sort of, the big exception of the antebellum and segregationist South, and then the sort of smaller arguable exception of post-revolutionary New England. I guess there's sort of a vanished tradition of Northeastern conservatism that will be revived any day now. But there's sort of an endless wrangle then over, well, what does that mean? Are the only conservatives conservative liberals and so on, which connects to some of the debates being had on the new right that Matt was talking about in the first panel today. But I mean, I think one way to look at it in the 20th century context is that America had a kind of small c conservative ruling class that was sort of associated with the WASP ascendancy, sort of this core set of mainline Protestant denominations that effectively dissolved itself and was transmuted through the power of meritocracy into Mandarin liberalism, which has been with some complexity, our governing class since the 1950s and 1960s. And modern conservatism has always been forged in reaction to that governing class, and has never succeeded in displacing it. And I think that means that whatever conservatives think as a matter of theory, you can be an American conservative in theory. As a matter of practice, the populist side has always sort of returned with a rush. The instant, I mean, you could look at it in the context of George W. Bush's presidency, right? Like, there was this moment after 9/11, which I remember pretty vividly because I was just starting out as a journalist then, when, there was this sense that after the terrorist attacks, the country had swung sharply to the right, and the American elite had, was becoming more open to conservative ideas. And Bush himself was this immensely popular president for this very brief window. And so there was, I think, this sense among some people on the center right then that, like, well, this was the moment when conservatism could move from being a sort of counter elite to just being a governing elite. But then as soon as that fell apart, and it fell apart pretty quickly between the invasion of Iraq and the financial crisis, then the populist side of conservatism just came rushing back and has been with us in sort of successive waves, Tea Party and Trumpist, ever since. But in that sense, the only way you could imagine a world where American conservatism ceases to be primarily populist would be a world where the liberal elite was finally displaced by a conservative elite. And that seems more distant than ever right now.
I'm doing my part on the college grounds there to recruit young conservatives to go into all these organizations that are dominated by the left, because we need bodies, and we got to start recruiting. But you mentioned 9/11. Patrick, in your book, you mentioned briefly 9/11, saying that was sort of a watershed in American political history. Anything you want to add about the effects of 9/11 to the conservative side of it, instead of just the politics writ large? Obviously, it changed a lot of things.
Well, I do think that Ross is absolutely right, because it was one of those moments where a lot of illusions are shattered all at once. Certainly after the end of the Cold War, there was this giddy moment, wasn't there? The peace dividend, the hope that the long deferred hope that from now on more and more of the world will become democratic and democracies don't fight each other, and that we now encountered a way of resolving
the end of history.
End of history, exactly, right. Fukuyama.
Right.
Yeah. But then suddenly, it flung us right back into the Dark Ages, and we realized, wow, there really is a clash of civilizations going on here. And so that gave a new credibility to the most anti-utopian political theorists. And I think conservatism itself is steadily pessimistic or steadily realistic about the characteristics of human nature. The will to power and the propensity for violence is very strong. Sooner or later, we're going to have to fight, and therefore we should be ready to fight on the strongest possible terms. But again, as Ross says, I agree with this also, that the disastrous venture in Iraq very quickly eroded a credibility which the conservatives, or the right, I'm not sure they're the same thing, had acquired at least briefly, but wasn't able to retain.
How do both of you describe conservatism today to young people who don't know everything we've just heard for the last panel and this one, who don't know that history? Let me. Why don't I say the way I've described it, and then you can react and see, do you agree or disagree? Is this a good way to do it? Is, in brief, I say conservatism means different things in different cultures. In China, conservatives want to conserve, say, the Maoist revolution. In Iran, they want to conserve the rule of the Ayatollahs. And in the United States, American conservatism wants to conserve the founding values. And some of those are more important than others, and I'd love to hear which ones you think are more important. But is that a good way to describe it to young people, that that's what conservatism at its core is, or is there something else that we seek to preserve?
I mean, I usually start in a similar place, though I maybe don't use the Maoist example. But I think it's reasonable to look at conservatism in any given context as the effort to sort of retain the established traditions of a given culture or society. I think in the American context, I usually stress the idea that America has had this kind of, along with our written constitution, a kind of unwritten constitution, or a kind of cultural constitution, which maybe is a pointless conflation of different categories. But that if you look at what 20th century American conservatives imagined them to be doing, they were trying to sort of conserve various forms of American exceptionalism, sort of American cultural habits and folkways that were somewhat different from the combinations that showed up in other modern societies, especially in Western Europe. So the ways in which America was distinctive would be America was more religious by the second half of the 20th century, pretty clearly more religious than other advanced societies. It was a more commercial and capitalist society than other advanced societies. It had a greater suspicion of centralized and state power. It was a more communitarian society. People were more likely to volunteer and give to charity and these kind of things. And that, if you think of American conservatism in that way, it makes sense of some of the apparent contradictions that sort of end up placing, a Milton Friedman, even a Milton Friedman and a William F. Buckley, right, together in the same movement, where, yes, it doesn't make perfect sense that Ayn Rand would be on the American right, and so would a Baptist preacher who believed, that Ayn Rand was destined for perdition. But in fact, Rand was defending, in a particularly extreme way, certain aspects of American exceptionalism, the kind of economic aspects, and the Baptist preacher was defending the religious aspects. And they made sense as allies, even if the sort of perfect fusionism that Frank Meyer aspired to was kind of an impossibility. And I think if you look at conservatism that way, it helps explain the mess that the right is in, because all of those forms of exceptionalism have in various ways diminished over the last 40 or 50 years. America is now less religiously exceptional. It's, our sort of communitarian bonds have weakened. Our society, for all the talk about unfettered capitalism, is actually less economically dynamic than it was 40 or 50 years ago. These different features of American life that conservatives set out to defend have sort of weakened or declined together, which then raises the question, well, what are conservatives doing? What are they conserving? And it's how you get into a moment when, there's more appeal to the idea of something that I think could be more reasonably called reaction, where it's like, all right, we lost the things we were fighting for, so now we have to start again at the beginning, even if that means, questioning all the way back to the founding itself.
What do you say to young people? How would you?
Well, I spend a lot of time with young people because I'm a college professor. And here's one thing I often say to classes. I say, I never read the Declaration of Independence until I was already 22 years old, because I didn't grow up in America. And so whereas for them its rhetoric is so familiar, they've forgotten how to actually think about what it says. to me, the first time I read it, it was jarringly, obviously untrue. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Nothing could be less self-evident than that. And it's only at a very particular moment in American intellectual history that anyone would even say that. I mean, 30 years earlier, Jonathan Edwards wouldn't have said it in The Great Awakening. And so I say to the students, think about that. It may be that people are equal, although it's very odd to talk about them being made equal, because we're not really made, we're born. And when we're born, it's hard to think of the ways in which we're equal to our parents without whose goodwill we can't survive at all. But in any case, I say, there's nothing self-evident about it, is there, really? So when we say we hold these truths to be self-evident, I think it's the verb there which is the crucial bit. In other words, we're going to act as though we think it's true, while actually bracketing the question of whether it really is true or not. It might not be. Anyway, the students love this. They think, oh, this comical old Brit, listen to him. You know. And then I say, well, now, do you all still believe in equality? And they say, of course we do.
Right.
Yes. In other words, it's absolutely burnt deep into their psyches, which I love it. I think that's fabulous. And one of the things that's so exhilarating about life in America is this widespread belief in equality, which manages to coexist with the incredible actual inequalities that we see all around us. And I do think that that idea is closely linked to the idea of democracy, and that even the most brazen Trumpites of the last generation wouldn't be willing to say, here are entire categories of the population whose votes we've got to remove. You just can't find anyone who will say that.
No.
Yeah. Just as, obviously 50, 60 years ago, there were still large numbers of people who would say, we believe that segregation is right. You can't find anybody who'd say that now. And I think increasingly that you can't even find anyone who believes it.
No.
Yeah. So, that's an encouraging sign as well. When we think about the incredible abuse to which the idea of democracy has been subjected, it's astonishing to find how alive and well it really is.
Yeah, it's pleasant, isn't it? Because,
so I sometimes say to students in class, make the argument against democracy.
Right.
And the student looks absolutely perplexed and usually starts making the arguments for democracy. And I say, yes, but we know that, but now tell us the opposite. They can't do it.
That's a great sign.
Yeah.
Because it's in vogue right now to say our democracy is going over the cliff and how horrible and evil it is. So I think that's very heartwarming.
Yeah.
Let's take a minute. The last panel was all about personalities and all kinds of fascinating people who have brought us to where we are today. And it sort of begs the question, how much of conservatism has been a function of specific personalities and how much of it is policy? And so, Barry Goldwater was a very different person than Ronald Reagan, who was a very different person than Jack Kemp. I won't even get into it. Jennifer made some references to some of these celebrities in pop culture. And I was thinking of Kanye West, but I don't think he's really a true conservative. But how much do each of you think personality matters versus, it's sort of the great man theory of history. How much does that come into play with the history of conservatism? And obviously, we'll get to Trump at the end of this. But for the earlier side, how much of it do you think is personality? How much do you think is policy?
It's a really good question. It's just a way of hesitating for
okay.
a second. I think you have these figures in intellectual life, and Buckley and Crystal were huge ones. For religious conservatives, you could add a figure like Richard John Neuhaus, who ended up playing these kind of impresario roles. And in so doing, definitely had outsized influence on what came to be seen as sort of the intellectual core of conservative thought. And that, again, I think is a distinctive feature of our own moment, that it's harder to think of, there's sort of an endless cacophony of conservative voices. It's a little bit harder to think of who those sort of impresarios of intellectual unity are. And maybe the internet makes some version of them impossible, but it feels conservatism right now feels more defined by its highly competitive schools and factions than it does by presiding personalities. And 30 or 40 years ago, I would say at the intellectual level, it felt more defined by presiding personalities. In terms of mass politics, the office of the presidency is just, and again, this sort of became so in the second half of the 20th century, more so in the past, but just such an outsized force that anyone who seems to occupy that office successfully really gets to have a lot of control over what is conservatism for a particular window of time. And the two men who were the most successful at that were Reagan and George W. Bush, with the crucial difference being that Reagan's presidency was sort of deemed to be a success, and then his successors seemed less impressive. And so his influence, in various ways just seemed to sort of extend itself into the future, whereas Bush's presidency was deemed a failure and his influence seemed to evaporate almost instantly. It was, this incredibly popular figure on the right who just, by 2012 and certainly by 2016 just didn't seem to matter at all. And just to finish with the present moment, I think it's really uncertain which kind of figure Trump will be. As president and as leader of the party, he had an incredible power to shape the style and manner and public understanding of conservatism. Normally, losing and being a one-term president would sort of strip that from him very quickly. Being a kind of pre-existing celebrity and having fashioned this narrative where he didn't really lose has been a way for him to extend that. And we're sort of in this uncertain zone right now where we just don't know how far that extension will go.
Before I go to you real quick, how much do you think, along those lines, if the presidency is a way of defining conservatism, how much do you think Biden's actions right now are helping to define conservatism?
I don't think Biden is a strong enough figure to define anything at the moment. I think the arguments about what conservatism should be are very interesting right now, but are sort of quite separate from Bidenism in a way that wasn't true with Obama. With Obama, it was like, all right, Obama was for universal health care, conservatives were against it. That was just the debate of the first 2 years. And all of these people on the right who had spent the Bush era not really caring about health care policy one way or another suddenly organized themselves into this faction that had intense views on the individual mandate and so on. And there's really nothing like that with Biden. There's conservative opposition to some of his policies, but there's no sense that to be on the right is to be anti-Biden in the way that it was to be anti-Obama for a few years. So I think, there's sort of these general trends that I alluded to that have created a kind of crisis for conservatism's self-understanding. Those are really important to the right, and the shadow of Trump is really important to the right. Internet culture, a lot of things like that are important to the right. Biden himself.
I mean, so you're not buying into his Atlanta speech, where he's saying anybody who's opposed to him is Bull Connor, and remember that, just horrible name calling that was going on. You think that's just sort of water off their backs? That's not sticking, and that's not defining conservatives as much as he would like it to. It's not working.
Well, I mean, I think internal to liberalism, there are strong narratives about the right, which we've alluded to already, where the right is, supposedly becoming an authoritarian formation, hostile to democracy. But Biden himself is not shaping those currents. When Biden gives a speech like that, he's just sort of picking up. I mean, to be, the reasonable way of describing this is the Biden administration is staffed by people who voted for Elizabeth Warren. And so a certain share of what you get from Joe Biden is, there's sort of a part of his presidency that is Bidenism.
Right.
But more so than with a different kind of president or nominee, a lot of it is that the sort of Warren part of the Democratic Party expressing itself through a president who's only partially on board. And you said he gave the speech, but it's not. It's not quite that, right? Like he gave the speech, and then his press secretary partially walked it back, and then he partially walked it back. And I think on the right, there were people who acted very offended by that speech. But again, I don't think anyone takes Biden seriously enough as an organizing figure to be like, okay, Biden believes this and we must rally against it. I think it's understood that there is a kind of complex of progressive liberal thought that manifests itself through his administration to some extent, but Bidenism is just not a thing.
Okay.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, what do you think, Patrick?
Well, certainly on this matter.
Do some rank punditry.
That's your job.
Sink to our level.
Back to the historian, yes.
Well, this question of personalities, I think they're very important. That think about the 1950s and early 60s, that in the early 50s, Mr. Republican was Taft. And he was famously a grim, grey, dismal, very hard-working, very intelligent, very policy-oriented person. But it was impossible to like him. And nobody did.
I forgot to tell you he's my uncle. No, I'm just kidding.
His family loved him.
In that case, you dread family reunions.
Just kidding.
And I think the whole Republican establishment breathed an enormous sigh of relief in '52 when Eisenhower came along to be the candidate instead, because he was so likable.
Yeah.
On the other hand, people like Buckley said, Eisenhower is not a conservative. But then the next guy they'd got was Barry Goldwater, who, although he wasn't as monochrome as Taft, still, you got the feeling he was always gritting his teeth. And it was relatively easy for Lyndon Johnson to depict him as an extremist, with that famous unscrupulous ad about the nuclear weapon. And so those were two personalities who were both dysfunctional, whereas Reagan was the kind of person who was just infinitely likable. And all sorts of people had loved him in the movies. And when he went into politics, they might not like some of the policies, and they might think occasionally he said crazy things. But still, it was very difficult not to respond to his folksy allure. And I think he knew exactly how to turn it on and off as suited. And so he modeled the idea that a conservative can be a regular guy, that it doesn't have to be someone with terrifying, suspicious fears of commies. Oh, you see, McCarthy also, dreadful personality. And the John Birch people, with these feverish visions of the nation on the brink of catastrophe. Reagan wasn't interested in any of that. So he created the idea of conservatives as thoroughly likable people. And I don't think there's been a Republican leader like that since then. John McCain had got some of it, but not quite as much. And obviously, Trump completely failed in that department. I mean, he provoked animosity with just about every sentence he spoke, so that even his supporters were bristling with bile and venom and ill will. And you can't sustain an effective government in a civil society with a leader like that. So yes, the Republican Party's problem now is its search for a new personality who's likable among other than their professional activists.
So I'm going to put you down as not thinking that Trump should run in 24.
You're well done. Yeah.
Thank you. No. And so that brings up this whole question of, I think they named your column a few weeks ago, can Trump beat Trumpism, or which one is more important, Trump or Trumpism? And how do you define Trumpism, and which do you think is more important?
Well, the simplest way to define Trumpism is just to say it's the issues that he ran on in 2016 that were not the issues that Mitt Romney ran on in 2012. Meaning basically a conservatism that walks away a bit from entitlement reform, that is more hostile to mass immigration, and that is more open potentially to certain forms of social spending, with depending, and that is more, either non-interventionist or isolationist, depending on which term you prefer.
Tariffs,
in foreign
protectionism.
policy, right? And and then on trade, and there's some complexity there because Romney was actually pretty Trumpy in his view of China in 2012.
Yeah.
So there were and was more right-wing on immigration in that version of his candidacy than people sometimes remember. So there were, it wasn't actually, it never is in politics this sort of perfect break, but there was You could see it on the debate stage in 2016. Donald Trump was not a sort of movement conservative as that had been defined in the Tea Party era, especially. He, was sort of explicitly breaking from some things that people thought of as the Reagan inheritance. And that set of ideas, I think, has, some version of those ideas were, I think, just a sort of necessary adaptation to the post-George W. Bush era situation in the world, in the United States, and would be carried on by any plausible Republican successor to Trump, again, depending on events. But then Trump, but part of Trump's appeal was totally unrelated to that, right? And was just related to the man himself, and everything that you said about his how much he alienated people is true, but also he's an incredibly charismatic individual with, put it this way, one reason that I don't think the Republican Party as a whole is a threat to American democracy is I can't think of a single other Republican politician who would inspire someone dressed as a Viking to storm the Capitol, right? So that's good news for American democracy. But Donald Trump might be on the ballot in 2024, and he is, he is a demagogic figure who inspires a kind of loyalty that has nothing to do with policy and has everything to do with him as an embodiment of exasperation and exhaustion and rejection.
The crowd who says he's a bully, but he's our bully.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And that appeal, I think Trump ran, in certain ways, more on that in 2020 than he did in 2016. Some of the policy stuff dropped away, and it's hard to imagine him running in any other way in 2024. So that's probably not going anywhere either. But I think you can see what is distinctive about the moment now that wasn't true in 2016 is that the culture war writ large, which is something Republicans were clearly losing when Trump came along, has now swung to issue territory where generally Republicans can win. Like Glenn Youngkin can win an election in what seemed like the blue state of Virginia, running against basically sort of shifts in how progressives want to teach kids about race, right? And that creates a pretty obvious opening for Republicans going forward, as does the sort of overhang from COVID. That is not really, it doesn't exactly fit into Trumpian populism circa 2016. So it wouldn't be right to call it Trumpism, but it is something that has sort of emerged from the Trump era that wasn't really there before.
So the questions have started rolling in from the audience. And on this point, Patrick, do you think Trumpism has become the dominant definition of conservatism? Hatzi Valor is asking.
No, I don't think Trumpism is conservatism at all. I think it's really the antithesis of conservatism, because he's never shown any interest in conserving. In other words, nostalgia is the enemy of conservatism. Nostalgia is a delusion about the past, whereas conservatism ought to be a realistic appraisal of the past. Getting hold of your sense of what it was actually like and what it is about these previous eras that you would like to recover.
Like the founding values sort of thing.
For example, that's right. And obviously phrases like "Make America Great Again" appeal to some vague but not really very well-formed idea that America used to have been great, although Trump was never able to say, here's the period in which America was great from which it's fallen away. I suppose because he knew that as soon as you start studying the period in question, you can find all the shortcomings that it had. So there's all the difference in the world. I mean, one thing that's become clear to me over the course of today is how remote conservatism is from right-wing politics. I don't think that Trump embodied conservatism, and strikingly, all sorts of Bernie Sanders voters, when he didn't become the Democratic candidate, then voted for Trump. That's itself suggestive
two
testimony,
sides,
isn't it?
two sides of the same coin. Yeah. Fascinating. Just so you know, I'm not texting my friends. This is how we get the questions from the audience. So another good one that just came in from Lisa Smith. What are the panelists' definition of the elites, which I was going to go to next? You were talking earlier about the problems of elites versus pure democracy. Are you born an elite or do you become an elite? Either one?
Both.
Both.
I mean,
There's many pathways to holiness.
well, I think, I mean, for one thing, there are many elites, right?
Yes.
And the United States is a nation of 300 million people, and you have local elites, you have state elites, you have people who get rich, who get rich as entrepreneurs, and you have people who get rich as corporate lawyers and so on. And so in all of this, there's kind of a spirit of windy generalization, for which I apologize. But the elite that specifically modern conservatism, or the modern right, if we prefer, has been arrayed against, is the elite that is formed by meritocracy, by a system of using elite American colleges and universities and the sorting mechanism of high school resumes and SATs in order to select the kind of people who will work for big media corporations, staff the important offices in the federal bureaucracy, end up as Supreme Court clerks writing opinions behind the scenes, and staff essentially the unelected portions of centralized American power. And that elite is not left-wing in the sense that Bernie Sanders would understand the term. It is sort of center-left, technocratic, the spirit of Anthony Fauci sort of, presides over it. But it is not right-wing. And to the extent that there has existed a sort of right-wing portion of the elite, it has tended to be, concentrated in, traditionally in Wall Street and corporate America. But even that sort of zone has become more sort of culturally progressive over the last 20 or 30 years, and more shaped by sort of patterns within the larger meritocracy, which then leaves conservatives as the conservative elite is sort of local capitalism, car dealership owners and so on, and people who work in extractive industries, and which again there's real power there. There is a real conservative elite, but it is a less influential force in American culture, I would say, than this sort of broad-based meritocracy, which, to return to the original question, is created by a combination of education. Anyone can get into one of these schools if they, maybe not the SAT anymore, but traditionally they did well enough on the SAT. But then there's inevitably this sort of reproduction of privilege where if your parents went to Harvard and Yale, you were more likely to go to Harvard and Yale. Chelsea Clinton, was she born to the elite, or or
nature versus nurture?
Did she make her way into it? I think we can answer that question.
Yeah. It's funny though, isn't it? In America, it's very unusual to find people who will give a full-blooded defense of the idea of elitism. In other words, if you accuse someone of being an elitist, that's clearly a pejorative term.
Yes.
I don't think it should be, but it is, because it implies that the person being accused is regarding him or herself as better than everybody else. But of course, the reality is that we live in an elite-driven society. It's such a complicated world, which has got such high levels of which demands levels of technical expertise to run. We've got to have people who can do that, and we've got to train them by meritocratic means in the knowledge that we're training them to do things which most people can't manage. I teach at an elite school, and I tell the students not to be ashamed of that, because what they've been doing is climbing up the meritocratic pole as hard as they can. And they need to be clear-headed about the fact that it's good that they should become an elite, because the running of the society without them is impossible. I mean, incidentally, I did think it was striking how in the Trump administration, the level of sheer incompetence was incredibly high. All sorts of government offices remained unfilled. The sheer technical difficulty of running parts of it, there just didn't seem to be available people to do that. So I foresee, although not with much confidence, the re-evaluation of the concept of elitism with much more positive valence.
Although the Biden administration's handling of COVID has not.
Right.
I was talking to a very intelligent liberal who follows public health very closely recently, who said something like, well, you know, when the Biden team took over, I thought I could just finally stop paying attention to this stuff, and that finally the CDC would have everything in hand, and it was not to be.
No.
So even I think one of the challenges of the last 15 years that has also given rise to populism is that the system has either the system has become too complex even for the technocrats to manage, or something in their technocratic education has gone wrong, leading to more careening disasters than one would hope for a system supposedly designed to put experts in charge.
Well, members of elites are famous for being complacent, aren't they? And for thinking that they understand it all. Whereas COVID has clearly shown that there are limits to their capacity to encompass a problem, because it's got so many dimensions. You can focus just on the public health thing, but then there are serious economic costs, or you can concentrate on the economy and there are other adverse side effects. So members of elites need to be modest and self-aware of their own limitations.
Let me take a moment to say that our viewers can send in questions by email to nicole.penn, P-E-N-N, @aei.org, and at Twitter at #AEI conservatism. So we'd love to keep the questions going. Another one that I think, Ross, you touched on in your column this week, which is just excellent and right on point for everything we're talking about today. So thank you for that.
I was inspired by the invitation.
I remember being on a panel on CNN probably 10 years ago against a liberal commentator, and he was making the argument that demographics are destiny, that because of the demographic changes about to sweep in the United States, the Republicans and conservatives would be just out of business in no time whatsoever. And there was going to be this governing majority on the left for many years based on the assumption that certain demographic groups would automatically vote Democratic. And I pushed back against that and said, I think there's a battle for every soul, and I think you make your case to everybody. And sure enough, I was never invited back. But you touched on that there's demographic changes in the United States that are causing different demographic groups who weren't necessarily conservative in the past to start voting Republican. Why do you think that's happening? Has it happened before? If you have insights on that, can we talk about that just a little bit? The identity politics not really playing out the way they thought that it would.
Well, it's definitely happened before. The white Southerners used overwhelmingly to vote Democratic. Then after the Civil Rights Movement, there was this enormous shift to the Republican Party. So there's no question that these allegiances aren't irrevocable. I mean, in the South before 1960, the Democratic primary was really election day, because then it was a foregone conclusion that the Democrat would win. Totally different now, and so it certainly does follow that members of all sorts of different groups aren't foreordained to vote one way or the other, and any party which fell into the mistake of thinking that they were going to would soon be out of luck.
And that's
but then it's also true that these shifts happen because of changing facts on the ground and policy shifts within the political coalitions, right? So if the people who confidently predicted that, for instance, Hispanic immigration would lead to huge Democratic majorities, were tacitly assuming that the Democratic Party would continue to sort of sit ideologically roughly where it sat in, let's say, 2004, right? But what has actually happened since then is that the Democratic Party has moved well to the left on both economic and social issues of where it stood when John Kerry ran for president. So if you had a Democratic Party today that just took all of Kerry's positions in 2004, it probably wouldn't be losing Hispanic votes to the Republicans. So it's because of that shift that then the party coalitions have shifted. And so, I mean, there's a sense, right, in which if all you're focused on is, can Republicans win elections, then the answer to demographic questions is, sure, they can always win elections because parties adapt. So an America that changes in these ways, the Republican Party will adapt, it will still be able to win elections. But let's say you were a Republican really committed to the idea that we need to privatize Social Security, just to pick an example of something George W. Bush was trying to do in 2006. Well, in that case, demographic change has made it a lot harder for you because Hispanics are less likely to be libertarian and less likely to favor substantial changes to the safety net, and that is manifest in how the Republican Party has shifted. So if you care about ideas, there are real consequences to these demographic shifts. They can sort of push certain ideas out of the political debate in relatively short periods of time.
We've got one here that's on a little bit different subject from Mark Plattner at the National Endowment for Democracy. Can you say something about national conservatism and how it maps against the conservative history and present that is being discussed? I assume that means nationalism. Rich Lowry wrote a book on it, In Defense of Nationalism. Where does that fall into the conversation today and how conservatives are presenting themselves? It's not just a uniquely American thing. There's national conservatism in other countries as well. How do you see that playing into current politics? Any thoughts?
I suppose one recent event I'd make reference to here is the Brexit election of 2016. I'm a dual citizen. I'm a citizen of both Britain and the United States. And
it shows in your rank hostility to the Declaration of Independence.
And if I'd been in Britain, I would have voted against Brexit. It seemed to me that on the balance, although there were arguments to be made both ways, it's a shame that Britain left. On the other hand, I do understand it because membership in the European Union entailed a loss of British people's feeling that they controlled Britain's destiny. That, in other words, they had to sacrifice a lot of their national pride and were unwilling to do so. The pro-Brexit forces said, Europe is very bureaucratic, it's very remote from ordinary voters' concerns, it's taking away everything that's distinctive about it. Let's seize once more our own destiny. And of course, there's something very attractive about that, to which the electorate responded unexpectedly, wholeheartedly. I mean, I think both the proponents and the opponents of Brexit kind of thought it would lose and woke up to the astonishing discovery that they'd won and are now having to live with the consequences.
They do like their elites over there. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the American context, there's a clear connection to what happened with Brexit and a clear connection to trends in a lot of countries around the world where, there's a backlash against globalization, against a sense of a loss of sovereignty. There's a sense that the sort of globalized world order is weaker than it looked 20 years ago, more amenable to revision and challenge by China above all, but other powers as well. And then there's a sense that, that's connected to these sort of problems of American exceptionalism that I was talking about before, that sort of America has these domestic problems, these sort of collective domestic problems associated with deindustrialization and drug addiction and family breakdown that are connected in some way to globalization and require, in effect from the right, a less libertarian response. And so in that sense, what gets called national conservatism, it is sort of the attempt to do Trumpism without Trump. It is sort of the attempt to come up with an agenda that speaks to these sort of challenges of the loss of the exceptionalisms that conservatives were defending. Whether it has that agenda is a totally open question, right? I think there's still quite a gap between the things that get talked about as popular ideas at the big conference on national conservatism and what actually you can imagine a successful Republican candidate running on and governing on. Rebuilding factories and banning online pornography are both things that I'm in favor of. I'm not completely sure that they're the basis for the DeSantis administration of 2024. But that's I think, the best way to understand national conservatism, so-called, is effectively sort of an attempt to adapt conservative ideas to the challenges that produced the Trump era in the first place. And there's also a return, to sort of traditions of Republican politics, capital R Republican politics, that, the Republican Party used to be the party of tariffs and internal improvements in the late 19th century, right? So there's sort of a return of aspects of American politics that had disappeared that, that you can get as majorities wash back and forth and new challenges arise.
So you made a comment early on about conservatives, the right, not being able to break through, say, 48% of the electorate. And I'm certainly focused on that as a speechwriter, that I'm always trying to get the people in the middle, not just energize the base and try and widen the net. There's two questions that have come in from two different viewers. One is Kurt Byron says, should not conservatives, rather than arguing amongst ourselves what is conservatism, not that we're doing that, focus instead on fighting the left? And that is kind of a question. Do you promote what you stand for, or do you try and stop the craziness coming at you? Or the second question that's sort of on a similar vein is, does the increasing reliance on courts and obstructive tactics like the filibuster suggest that conservatives are increasingly less interested in gaining the support of Democratic majorities? So it's sort of a strategy question. Do we try and get past 47%, or do we just try and stop through obstruction whatever we don't like? So what's been going on in the past? Would you say what's been effective in the past, stopping the bad or promoting the good?
Well, there have been many periods in American history of profound dysfunction. In other words, I don't think the current situation is unique. If you look at the politics of the 1790s, it's astonishing that the Republic held together at all, because the rancor and the vitriol was so incredible then.
Right.
Yet somehow they managed to pull it through. I suppose many of the people in this audience are thinking back implicitly to the period of the Cold War, when a great outside threat had a unifying effect within the nation. So that one of the questioners here is asking about fighting the left. Fighting is a very bad metaphor for democratic politics, because democratic politics only works well when there's a fairly high degree of agreement all the way across the spectrum, and in which people are willing to compromise and to trade favors back and forth. So the rhetoric of polarization is itself a highly regrettable thing. But I'm also struck by, I'm sure everybody is, there are two worlds we inhabit. One is the world where we're reading the news or watching the TV or listening to politicians, which imply a great cosmic struggle. But then the other world is the world of everyday life in the neighborhoods where we live, in which nearly everybody seems profoundly reasonable, because they all drive on the right side of the road. They all bring the dustbins out on the right day, at the right time of the week. They're all worried about their kids being in a good school. It's only around the margins that this pseudo-apocalyptic stuff is taking place. It isn't actually the fabric of everyday life. I mean, when you look at China during the Cultural Revolution. That was a place when literally anybody could be killed in the space of the next day or two. Yeah, there's nothing like that going on here now. So what we need to do is lower the rhetorical temperature.
And I assume that you like earmarks. Back in the day, when you were saying we all get along and we trade things back and forth, do you think we should bring back earmarks?
Well, I mean, Churchill's remark applies, doesn't it? Democracy is the worst possible system of government, except for all the others. There's nothing beautiful about it, but it worked. It was a pragmatic response to conditions in which everybody would get something out of the deal. Yeah.
So I slightly disagree, or I guess I think that the sort of low-temperature horse trading is an essential part of how an effective legislature works. But I think U.S. politics at the national level has historically been distinguished by large-scale landslides, usually, where the country is very polarized, but one side ends up with 55 or 60% of the vote. And that in turn then sort of feeds back into the horse trading, because everybody knows that, a given president, Franklin Roosevelt or later a Ronald Reagan, has a certain kind of popular mandate that they can use if the other political party is too intransigent and won't actually horse trade. So in that sense, one of the features of our own era, one of the reasons you have this breakdown and dysfunction, is that neither political party can figure out how to be to polarize effectively, right? To split the country, but end up with the much bigger part. And so you have the it's essentially Republicans are at 48 or 49%, and Democrats are at 50 or 51%. But all that is a recipe for sort of swinging back and forth constantly. But you need a certain kind of, positive polarization, right? Like Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan were both hated in various ways. They were hated by the minority factions that they, ranged themselves against and defeated. And that, I think, is in certain ways how our system is set up to work. And it may not be possible to reproduce those kind of landslides under current conditions, but if not, it is actually a problem for the system, because that's how we've historically gotten things done, I think, in the US. The eras of successful governance have their bipartisanship has tended to be forced by an overwhelming presidential mandate. Even Eisenhower, the Eisenhower era is in certain ways a very bipartisan era, but Eisenhower himself is a hugely successful politician who crushes Stevenson, crushes the Democrats. And that's what's been missing, I think, in our politics, really since Reagan, in certain ways.
Let me ask you about this. They touched on it in the previous panel, but since both of you have written books on this, the idea of the Catholic tradition in conservatism, they touched on the Jewish tradition as well. You mentioned Richard John Neuhaus. I'd go back even to Pope John Paul II and how much influence he had on the conservative movement. Where do you see that now? Are Catholics just as powerful within the movement as they used to be? Obviously, the majority of the Supreme Court is Catholic now, I believe. And so is that something going forward to build on, or do you think this is sort of the heyday and it's going to drop off from here?
I would say Catholics are less significant now than they were, partly because of the enormous change which has taken place inside the Catholic Church itself. That before the mid-1960s, the Catholic laity was very deferential to the clergy and to the bishops. But increasingly, they became better educated than the priests, and they became less and less willing to subordinate the views which they gained in the elite institutions to the teachings of their church. So that, for example, when the papal prohibition on contraception was issued in 1967 or 8, Humani Vitae, that was just about the period when most American Catholics stopped obeying it. In other words, it was meant to be a reaffirmation, we won't use artificial contraceptives. But what actually happened is that from then on, most of them did. So if you look at the shrinkage in the size of the typical American Catholic family, it's quite clear that the use of contraceptives was becoming normal. So that's one thing. And then it's also true that since the 1970s, the Catholic clergy took an enormous migration towards the political left, perhaps most clearly seen in the contrast between the current Pope and John Paul II. Because John Paul II came out of Poland. He was the living embodiment of opposition to communism. Just by breathing, he was anti-communist, and was a fantastic rallying point for solidarity, and then for all the enthusiasm for the end of the Soviet Union on this side of the Berlin Wall. Whereas the current papacy is really quite closely aligned with the politics of the left. So I think it's actually much more difficult for conservative Catholics to feel that they've now got an absolutely granitic organization behind them than it was half a century ago.
So I agree with that as a description of the influence of the Catholic Church as an institution. I think it's less influential in American life than at any point in my lifetime, and the influence of the Catholic hierarchy over conservatism is not high, I would say. In terms of Catholic intellectuals, though, I think we are in an era when there is probably more influence of conservative and traditionalist Catholicism within elite conservative institutions than there was even 20 or 25 years ago. And partially that reflects the diminished influence of libertarianism, driven in part by some of these trends that I keep talking about. In part, it reflects sort of the continued decline of high church Protestantism as a kind of intellectualized alternative. But the dynamic that you see on the Supreme Court is effectively the dynamic, I think, across a lot of conservative institutions, that intellectual Catholics, often Catholic converts, supply sort of, the elite level intellectuals, even as the church as a whole weakens. And Catholicism, which is, traditionally seen as this sort of mass working class religion, ceases to be as influential at that level, and much of American conservatism becomes ever more evangelical. In Washington and New York, Catholicism is sort of, if you just pick someone who's 27 and on the right of center in a major American city or a major American university, my guess is that they are more likely to be Catholic than they were 20 years ago, which creates all kinds of weird dynamics. It's weird to have a movement of evangelicals led by Catholic lawyers. That's kind of weird. It's weird to have this sort of conservative Catholic intelligentsia with all this influence in elite Republican politics who are at odds with their own church, maybe more profoundly so over the next 20 years. I don't know where those dynamics go, but I think they're certainly real.
The question of the Supreme Court's interesting too, isn't it? Because presumably the Catholic members of the Supreme Court are extraordinarily attentive to the fact that they mustn't be seen to be making Catholic decisions. They've got to be seen to be
Not
making...
Clarence Thomas, but the others, yeah.
All right.
But I mean, but that's an example, right?
Yeah.
So yes, the current members of the Supreme Court, for the most part, are originalists and textualists whose school of thought, bears a certain resemblance to Catholicism in its method, but not in its theory. But then the next generation of would-be conservative jurists are, at least somewhat more likely to be influenced by Catholic intellectuals making a case for a kind of natural law jurisprudence. Now, again, how big a deal that is overall, I don't know, but it used to be that sort of originalism was the rightward flank of conservative judicial philosophy. And, now it's something a little somewhere between Hadley Archie's, Clarence Thomas and Adrian Vermeule is the rightward flank. And there's something different than the studious caution that you're describing, I think, in that next cohort.
We're getting excellent questions from the audience. Claire Jerry asks, I'll sort of summarize it. Both of you, I believe, have written about technology, social media, things like that. Where do you see this, the impact of it on political discourse, not just within the conservative movement, but in the way that conservatives and liberals interact? Has it changed our political rhetoric? Is it always going to be this way? How do you see the impact of social media on conservatives today?
I haven't written about it.
I was thinking you had.
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
sorry.
and in fact, I haven't yet sent my first tweet. That
Oh,
lies
well, there's
lies
still
in
hope.
the future.
We'll get you involved.
Now's the time, right here. We can capture it live.
But, I mean, one of the things that, if you think about the Norman Rockwell version of democracy, it's that lovely painting of the town meeting when the ordinary citizens, after a hard day's work, show up and make and express their feelings. And they speak wholeheartedly, but also courteously. It is sadly true that the compartmentalization of political discourse and the abstraction of it by social media enables people to say what they think without actually facing their antagonist. So that's a shame, and it leads to a degradation of good manners.
I think it's among many other things plainly an accelerant for the populist side of conservatism as against the institutionalist side. That this is true in every aspect of global life, really, that with the exception of the tech companies themselves and certain media companies that resemble tech companies, I won't name any particular names, there with those exceptions, the effect of the internet is sort of corrosive of institutional norms and empowering to populism. But then it also makes it difficult to turn the populism into governance. So yeah, generally it's a change for the worse. Not sure it's so much worse in politics and other areas, but it's something that certainly the culture has not successfully adapted to this technological shock, I would say.
I will do something for Claire Jerry's benefit that I totally disapprove of, which is when a moderator answers their own question. But I just can't help myself because I teach political speech writing, and as corrosive as I think social media is to our polity, I think there will always be a place for well-reasoned, persuasive arguments and making your best case to the electorate. And so I put me down as an optimist that I'm hoping that will still continue in our politics and that social media won't just eat us all alive. So I'm in favor of good speeches. So let's go to one from John Soliday. Have conservatives lost core beliefs in individual liberty and responsibility and open markets? I mean, that sort of goes back to Trumpism. Do we still believe in open markets, or do we like protectionism now? You know, do we stand for individual responsibility, or do we like more and more social safety net programs? You know, where do we come down on core values?
Well, it's a false question because with respect, the person writing the question implies that there was a time when conservatives were unified around the defense of free markets. I'm not sure that's actually true.
Yeah, your whole book is about the changes over time, back and forth. And
exactly.
Change.
Think about it this way, that nothing has done more to transform the world in the last 2 centuries than capitalism. It's the most revolutionary force that we've probably ever witnessed since the Neolithic Revolution. Mm-hmm. And it's only a very, very curious set of circumstances which have led us to describe any version of capitalism as being conservative. I mean, it was only because communism was even more transformative in ways which were terrifying, that we can say of capitalism that its defenders are conservatives. Because, I mean, one of the great phrases that you hear a lot at the moment among business people particularly is disruptors. And I always thought that disruption was a bad thing, but now that's clearly taken on a positive quality. Oh, he's a disruptor. This has got to be.
I've always thought of you as a disruptor. Yes.
But anyway, of course it's disruptive. Yes, it disrupts traditional ways of doing things.
Right.
And in that sense, it's very anti-conservative.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Ross, what do you think?
I mean, I think that, you know, in answering prior questions, I've sort of stressed the ways in which Trumpism and conservatism in the last 5 or 10 years has become less libertarian, less free markets oriented, more likely to question sort of, you know, certain limited government views, free trade, globalization, all of these things. At the same time, you know, if you look at the right of center response to the pandemic, it has been extremely libertarian in the United States. Mm-hmm. You know, that to a degree that I would not have predicted 2 or 3 years ago if you had told me that not just like a year or 2 into the pandemic, but from the very beginning, you know, restrictions on businesses, mask wearing, all of these things would sort of provoke a surge of primarily right-wing rebellion. I think speaks to the, you know, there are sort of these deep currents in American life that are there, you know, regardless of what's happening in coalition politics and so on. And, you know, I don't want Anthony Fauci telling me what to put on my face is clearly a very deep-rooted, not for all Americans, but for a certain segment of America, an incredibly deep-rooted sentiment, so that even in a presidency that was overall defined by the reorientation of conservatism in a somewhat less libertarian direction, in the face of this particular crisis, you had this surge of right-wing individualism, folk libertarianism, whatever you want to call it, that shaped the entire U.S. response to the pandemic, down to the, you know, the vaccine debates of the last year, right? Like, it was the Donald Trump vaccine And conservatives have been certainly the most resistant to mandates, sort of a segment of conservatism very resistant to taking the vaccines, even though literally they came from Trump himself. So that's, I think, a case study in sort of, the resilience of deep patterns of American life as against whatever's happening at elite level politics and in national political debates.
As we head into the midterms, I was thinking there was a book that we used in the class that I taught during the 2020 election, Mo Fiorina's Unstable Majorities, where he talks about the pendulum swinging back and forth. And if you think you're only going to be in power for 2 years, basically with a majority, you tend to overreach and try and get as much as you possibly can get passed, which I think is what we're seeing with Build Back Better and some of the things that the Biden administration is trying to do. If Republicans were to take back the House and Senate in the midterms and then presumably get the presidency in 24, where's the danger of overreach? Like, where in the past have Republicans overreached and they fell flat on their face? Or are there dangers that you see, the temptation to try and keep going and build with what's been working lately? Is there any danger that will go too far? Are they better off reining it in a little and not overreaching and maybe staying in power for a longer time? Like, if you were advising them, what would your strategy be for not overreaching?
Well, I have no idea what the Republican agenda in 2024 would be, right? I mean, I think in the past you would say that, Republicans, you can overreach with both economic and social conservatism, right? So you can tell a story, where George W. Bush's Social Security reform or trying to repeal Obamacare under Trump, represented forms of overreach. But I don't think there's right now sufficient agreement among Republicans about what the party, would necessarily stand for to be able to predict what the dangerous areas of overreach would be. You could imagine anything from a new Republican administration, ranging from, sort of government, attempts to cut government and transform entitlements along the, Paul Ryan plan mode, to huge new spending on industrial policy. Either of those are imaginable. And similarly on social policy, we have no idea how national politics might react to Roe v. Wade being overturned. You could imagine a world where Republicans overreach nationally on abortion. I don't think it's very likely because the National Party probably won't want to touch that issue. I guess I would say the most likely zone of Republican overreach these days is more likely to be at the state level, where you have sort of a successful politics of, sort of resisting critical race theory that can sort of morph into a policy where it looks like Republicans are, putting cameras in classrooms to surveil teachers, right? So I think that, sort of overreach in opposition to critical race theory is imaginable as a kind of state level problem for Republicans, but ask me again in 2024. I think the unsettledness of the Republican agenda just means it's really hard to know where the points of overreach would be.
Yeah.
I think a great example of overreach by Republicans came in 1994 with the contract with America. The Republicans won the midterms. Right. Newt Gingrich introduced the contract and gambled with the ability to completely thwart Clinton's agenda, even to the point of closing down the federal government. But in the end, he clearly got the worst of it, and was discredited by doing so. So I think that should be a salutary lesson about the hazards of overreach. It's also included, you remember that, the one clause in the contract for America was term limits. But then it turned out that he himself and nearly all the other Republicans would have to once resign, at which point they could have said, well, not so much with that one.
So I'll end with, on a positive note, just a quick question. What's making you hopeful? What do you see going forward for the conservative movement? What brings a smile to your face?
Come on.
Conservatism in itself is a very sensible thing. We're all intrinsically conservative because we want to hold on to the things in our world that we like. So it's got a future. But whether that future can easily be transfigured into policies is a different question.
Are you hopeful about our democracy?
Oh, very.
Good.
Yeah, because everybody believes in it.
Good. Yes. Ross?
I mean, I'm less peppy and hopeful about everything, conservatism, the future of America, all of these things. I would say I have I think that on the specific question of what happened in 2020 and January 6th and Trump's election fraud narrative and all of the fears of that replaying itself in 2024, from watching both Republicans and Democrats, what they're trying to do right now with the Electoral Count Act reform, has made me more optimistic that this sort of specific crisis point of, Trump-enabled constitutional crisis driven by election fraud is going to become less likely in 2024. And I think it's a good sign for the Republican Party if, in fact, Republicans in Congress, and particularly in the Senate, can work with Democrats to sort of deal with the actual weakness in our system that Trump tried to exploit. So it'll probably fall apart tomorrow after I've said something optimistic about it. But I do think that is, it's since we've been talking about ideological conservatism, but conservatism as a sort of a practically minded problem-solving disposition. I think both political parties and people in my profession certainly have a tendency to look at things like what happened between November and January in our politics and say, this represents this sweeping disaster that will have, implications as far as the eye can see, when in fact it might be that with the right piece of legislation, you can take that kind of scenario partially off the table and just sort of redirect the problems in our politics somewhere else. And part of effective conservative governance is just dealing with the immediate problem before you, fixing that, and hoping other problems take care of themselves. So maybe in some small way, that can happen in Washington in the next year with that particular challenge. How's that?
Are you
how's
hopeful?
That for vigorous?
Yeah, are you hopeful for our democracy?
For our democracy, I mean, I am hopeful relative to many of Patrick's colleagues and many of my readers at the New York Times. I'm kind of pessimistic about the general state of Western civilization, though, with our democracy.
You have to stop reading the comments section.
Part of that. I don't read the comments section. I just read the newspaper. That's the problem.
Okay, well, on that hopefully hopeful note, I don't know if I should turn it back to Yuval, but I just want to say thank you to Yuval, for everybody here at AEI for hosting us, the wonderful staff doing a terrific job outside the range of the cameras, and thank you for a delightful discussion, both of you. It was a privilege to be able to talk with you. Thank you.
Very good fun.
Thank you.